So yes, I guess we should start probably. A warm welcome to everyone in the room, dear virtual audience, dear colleagues on the virtual panel. I have the honor to welcome you to our webinar about Ukraine's recent law number 3894. And I would like to do this on behalf of the hosts of this webinar, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University and the Fortem Orthodox Christian Studies Center and its blog Public Orthodoxy. And I do this also very warmly in the name of my colleagues, Dmytro Vovk and Thomas Bremer. My name is Regina Elsner. We had the pleasure to prepare this event together. So this law on religious communities affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, which we are intended to discuss today, this law has prompted wide discussions already, and probably you have followed some of those discussions in the web and on sites on different. This law has been preparated for several years, and the discussions have been ongoing for several years, but also after its passing now in this year's summer, the discussions again propped up, and it is very timely to discuss the implications of this law. The heated debate has a lot of different layers, and this makes it extremely difficult to have a critical and a constructive conversation. And I guess every one of us somehow connected to this discussion has experienced very difficult discussions during the last months and days. And one of the main contextual difficulties we have is the ongoing war of aggression of the Russian state and of the Russian Orthodox Church against Ukraine, which uses and abuses the religious field in order to justify this war. So the balance of religious freedom on the one side and security on the other side has rarely been so contested as in the case of this law under these circumstances. With this webinar, we want to make some kind of effort to define some of the key questions in the legal framework. So it is rather a beginning, it is an impulse, it's of course no exhaustive analysis. And we are very grateful for 9 distinguished scholars who accepted our invitation to give a 5 minutes essence, I would call it, of their, of course, much broader expertise on this law. We will have 6 rounds. You saw the program with 2 experts on each round who will have 5 minutes to give an input, and then we have 20 minutes to discuss the particular question of this round. The audience, so you are heartily invited to write your questions in the Q&A. You will see that you have both the option of chat and of Q&A. I would ask you also on behalf of the other moderators to take the Q&A just to not have to look in 2 different places to collect the questions and to bring them to the speakers. Please also take care to put your questions short, also to put your answers short, so that we have the opportunity to discuss a wide spectrum of questions and topics. After 3 rounds, we will have a break of 20 minutes, and then we'll go on with the second part of the webinar. So after this very short introduction, I'm very happy to moderate into the first panel and to introduce the first 2 speakers. We have Jose Casanova from the Berkeley Center of Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and Catherine Wanner from Penn University. Both have worked in and with and about the Ukrainian religious landscape for decades, I would say. And the question we ask you to reflect upon is, in what way the framework of decolonization is important and is appropriate to understand this law and the context of this law. Jose, you have the first floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Regina, and thank you, the organizers and the sponsors, to initiate this very important, truly important conversation. I would like to make 3 points. First, view formally. The law is an obvious curtailment of the free exercise of religion in Ukraine. But if one takes into account the post-colonial context of the legislation comparatively, it is a fully understandable, and I would say, perhaps, legitimate curtailment of religious freedom. The second point, I will expand the points later. The second point, the legislation is highly ambiguous and probably non-enforceable. I will let the legal experts debate this point. I tend to view the legislation as a perhaps unfortunate and misguided, but nonetheless potentially fruitful attempt to pressure a clear Ukrainian, to pressure the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to assume a clear Ukrainian post-colonial stand without necessarily breaking its communion with Moscow. Why not demand unambiguously autocephaly from Moscow? Had it done so many lost opportunities, it will not find itself in the limbo in which it finds today. Perhaps it's too late, but it's still possible to try. Finally, I do not see the legislation as a real threat to the unique and exceptional situation of religious freedom in Ukraine, precisely because the way all the religious minorities in Ukraine have received the law without much fear, apparently. They still see the real threat coming from the Russian regime and from the rock as evidenced by the persecution of religious minorities in the occupied territories. So let me expand briefly on each of these 3 points. The First Amendment to the US Constitution very clearly says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. From this formal point of view, it is clearly a curtailment of the free exercise. Yes, we cannot forget that the author of the First Amendment was James Madison, perhaps the most important theologian of religious freedom of all the founding fathers, who spent the previous decade making sure that the Church of England would be disestablished in Virginia, and not only disestablished and changing its name to the Episcopal Church of the US, but also basically that it would weaken its de facto hegemony in Virginia. And he did so by fighting the bill proposed by Patrick Henry and other founding fathers, and eventually passing the Bill of Religious Freedom in Virginia that had been drafted by Thomas Jefferson with the help of the Baptist minorities. They thought that it is necessary for the Church of England not only to change its name, not only to be disestablished formally, but to adopt truly a post-colonial situation in which they would not be a threat of religious freedom to minorities. The fact is that 20 years after the passage of these legislations, what had been the established Church of England, the Episcopal Church, now was a minority religion, while the 2 minority sects that had been only 1% of the population at the time of independence had become the 2 largest denominations in the southern states. Similarly, in Latin America, the episcopate, the Catholic bishops, sided with the King of Spain and the colonial armies rather than with the people fighting for independence. As a result, for several decades, most dioceses in Latin America were without bishops because the Vatican refused to give to the new regimes the privileges it had given to the Catholic monarchs, and continued to give to Catholic kings in Europe, and later gave to the dictator Francisco Franco in Spain, namely a role in the nomination of bishops. So it is the need to adapt this post-colonial condition, which I think is the key to coming out of the crisis. The second point I'm saying, it is an opportunity for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, mixing up the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, to demand unambiguously autocephaly today from Moscow. Perhaps Moscow is and never was ready to give autocephaly, but then it will have a real ground why the need to break from Moscow and to look for communion within global orthodoxy and finding a way. Indeed, the solution to the crisis can only be found within global orthodoxy. Only a reconciliation of the Moscow Patriarchate and the Constantinople, Patriarchate of Constantinople, and the active role of all the Orthodox churches in creating a synodal process that participates in solving this crisis can be really, really helpful. Not criticizing the legislation per se, by working towards precisely a resolution within global orthodoxy to the crisis. Finally, I do not see it as a threat to religious freedom in Ukraine, because all the religious minorities which are gathered in Aukro precisely do not view it as such. For decades, I've been arguing that Ukraine is uniquely within Europe and within Orthodox societies developing a model of denominationalism, which breaks away from the Orthodox model of symphony of church and state, as well as from the West European Westphalian model of cuius regio, eius religio. I think that the role of religious minorities will be to impede what is the real threat to religious freedom in Ukraine, namely an imposed union of the two Orthodox churches with the pressure of the Ukrainian state. This will be the real threat to religious freedom in Ukraine, and I hope that all religious minorities, particularly the Greek Catholic Church, but also all the Protestant churches and the Jewish religious minorities and the Muslim religious minorities, will continue working together to precisely preserve the unique model of religious freedom which Ukraine has been developing so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose, for this first input. Katie, it's your turn.
So thank you. I want to echo thanks to the organizers and to everyone in the audience. I wanted to offer some thoughts on decolonization, a process which I understand to be one where the political and cultural effects of having been subordinate to an imperial center are removed from institutions and spheres of practice. I want to begin by asking, what would the process of decolonization, how would it have unfolded if the war never happened? And I suspect that there would have been a gradual decolonizing that occurred via modifications to social institutions that would have shifted cultural values and would have yielded real differences between Russia and Ukraine. And I think if we look at the religious landscapes in the two countries, we see that those differences have in fact emerged. The point is that when decolonizing processes evolve gradually, they tend to be durable because they're born of compromise and adaptation. So the first point I want to raise is that I think decolonization of Ukrainian society would have occurred anyway, with or without the war. Alas, we have a hybrid war that begins in 2014 and an invasion in 2022. And this is going to accelerate the process of decolonization. Decolonization, we see, is occurring in multiple spheres. We have decommunization laws that eliminate Soviet symbolism in public space, widespread use of Ukrainian language, and a multitude of religious organizations that have broken relations with their Russian counterparts, with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church being really the significant outlier in this case. The law that we're gathered here today to discuss is really a means to further decolonization of religious life as justified by security concerns. I want to acknowledge two things. If the means to decolonize are misguided, they could pervert the intended outcome and could result in something entirely different. And the second point is that this law and the need for accelerated decolonization is in direct response, I think, to the Russian world and efforts on the Russian side to use law, war, and other means to reconstitute a common spiritual political civilization with religious and political ruling centers in Moscow. And I think one cannot ignore that brute reality. I would like to offer two concerns about decolonizing Ukrainian society and then a concluding thought. The first point is one that I've rarely heard articulated, but I believe it to be true. I wonder to what extent this law doesn't make a mockery of the rule of law itself. Regina mentioned the unwieldy process that this law mandates. Is this law perhaps more symbolic than it is actually meant to be implemented? This law is clearly targeted. It's a targeted means to provoke a certain group to react. And as such, it represents an instrumentalization of law and religion for a specific political outcome in the name of national security. A second point is that the pluralism, which I think is well documented, and Jose referred to it, has to not be a benign form of pluralism, but rather a pluralism that involves active engagement with a wide spectrum of groups that draws on robust debate that once again will yield compromise and durable, fair solutions, even though that process can be messy and slow. It's very important to note that there is clearly broad popular support for decolonization, and specifically broad popular support to use religion for this purpose, even if it targets the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This broad support is also articulated by other religious groups and certainly among the elected officials who voted overwhelmingly to adopt this law. So in other words, we have to listen to the multitude of local voices that are in favor of this law. In the same breath, the Russian state uses hybrid means to manipulate people and regimes to do its bidding through the use of proxy agents. Recent charges of Russian election interference in Moldova, Georgia, and in the United States too, indeed have their intended destabilizing and diminishing effects for the peoples and the regimes of those countries. So to conclude, I want to suggest that I think we're in a new era of increasing receptivity to populism and authoritarianism. And as such, do we need different kinds of responses, legal, among others, to entirely new forms of threat? Given the highly critical Western reactions to this law, one must ask if it's possible for modern secular democracies to regulate religious affairs at all, if even when one does it under the draconian conditions of war with broad local support. I wonder, and I ask, if we have an overly absolutist understanding of religious freedom. The Russian state is weaponizing religion to regain its former standing on the world geopolitical stage, and Ukraine is far from its only victim, although I would quickly add it's its most shrill victim. But such weaponization of religion to advance political aims, which the model of church-state partnership common in Orthodox societies, which it invites, in fact, poses ever more poignant challenges to Western understandings of what constitutes religious freedom and how to safeguard it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for your input, and thank you both for being very strict on time. That's very helpful. So I encourage again the audience to post questions into the Q&A section. There are none at the moment, but you are invited to do so. But I see one question from one of the other speakers, from Dmytro. Please, Dmytro.
Thank you for your presentations. First of all, a very quick comment. I would say that it's a bit misleading that the law is not enforceable. Criminal law is always enforceable. And we do know that the Ukrainian government has already started its implementation, because there are several bylaws that must be developed for that implementations, and they are now in process, which means that the state is pretty serious about that. And the second comment, that I do think that there is a difference between the relevance of decolonization framework to Ukraine, to this law, to the situation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And the second question, a different question, is whether you can use the law to impose this sort of decolonization framework, or to implement this decolonization framework in a particular situation. But my question, Jose already elaborated on that, but still maybe you can comment on this more. What do you think is the most relevant decolonization experience to Ukraine? Because Jose mentioned the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, but I would say there is also the experience of Church of Mennonites in South Africa, which is still there, it still exists. There is also the experience of Quakers in the US, and you know that George Washington was very supportive to Quakers who were considered to be loyalists and allegedly support England, and so on and so forth. So what do you think is the most relevant to this situation?
I think it is important that in the US case that Jose gave, we do have 250 years and an ocean and a legal revolution that has occurred in between, and incentives to comply with laws such as EU membership and the like, which didn't exist 250 years ago. To my mind, the most apt point of comparison is perhaps Northern Ireland. Because Ireland is also an atypical colony. I see Ukraine as an atypical colony. Its historic relationship with Russia clearly has colonial overtones, but it's not the same kind of colonial relationship that one sees with overseas European empires and the various regions that they colonized. Northern Ireland also offers the use of religion as a means of expressing or registering a religious identity and signaling a political orientation, even though the Irish conflict with England and the Ukrainian conflict with Russia is not a religious conflict per se. It's not based on theology or specific conflicts of religious practice, but rather religion has become a shorthand way of framing an envisioned relationship between the two countries, be it Ireland and England or Ukraine and Russia. I would just add parenthetically to just one question that Dmytro raised. I think there are legal implications to many, many different aspects of decolonizing processes, given that decolonization is inevitably going to involve a wide spectrum of public institutions that, of course, are legally regulated, and they're going to yield certain cultural values, which then are going to find expression in law and elsewhere. So I see the two as very clearly connected.
If I may add, obviously there were three established churches in the colonies: the Congregational Church in New England, the Presbyterian Church in the Mid-Atlantic states, and the Church of England in the southern colonies. Of those, only the Church of England was truly part of the English state. The Presbyterian Church was linked to the Church of Scotland. The Congregational was dissident church from the English Reformation, as were the Quakers and the others. So we are talking of established churches that are linked to the state, not, of course, of other religious communities. In this respect, of course, any kind of religious community can survive in Ukraine, even if it was linked to Russia. And I think, as I've said many times, for me, the ideal situation will be one in which the three Kievan churches of Ukraine, the Greek Catholic Church, the link to Rome, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the autocephalos, now linked to the Constantinople, and the third, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church linked to Moscow, could survive as three churches, not in union, but in communion, learning to respect each other. It may be too late. It may be too late. This has been my wishful thinking for a long time. Now, perhaps, it is no longer possible. But what could make it possible is an act on the part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to really adopt a post-colonial identity. So it's not only the need to break from Rome, but really to become Ukrainianized in a certain extent, also in taking responsibility, not only to inherit all the privileges of the established church with the Russian Orthodox Church, but also to basically accept the responsibility for the many, many crimes committed by the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. And I think it is this act that will make it into a post-colonial church.
Thank you. So I have one question from Thomas and one question in the Q&A. Thomas, go first.
Thank you. Katie partly already answered my question before I could ask it, but I nevertheless want to ask whether, if I'm not wrong, I'm the one who in our preparation group who proposed this topic for this webinar. And my question was whether really the idea of colony and colonialism and decolonization is the right approach. Is it the right pattern to see Ukraine as a colony? No? And you said it's an untypical colony, as it is the case. It was the case with Northern Ireland. And it seems to me that the idea of an empire and imperialism and an imperial position in an empire would be much more adequate. So my question is to you, as someone who has no idea about these things, whether the post-colonial approach really can contribute to better analyzing and understanding the situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
My own view is that a more productive approach is decolonizing versus coloniality. I think ideally decolonizing processes should lead into a period of post-coloniality. I don't think we're there yet. It is an atypical case, and I think the problem is on the Russian side, the imperial agenda is far more typical. So in that sense, the model holds. In the Ukrainian case, I believe I see efforts on the ground to decolonize. I mean, that word is often used, and I think decolonizing processes are visible, whether one speaks about, as I mentioned, the decolonization laws or changes in language use, and now even in a religious domain of trying to tailor social institutions to local preferences, and in the process, purging them of practices or rules or obligations that are now perceived as having been imposed from outside. That is, to my mind, the essence of a decolonizing process. I do think there is a decolonizing process underway in Ukraine, in spite of the fact that it is, as I mentioned, an atypical colony.
I would add that obviously the colonization of a pre-existing Ukrainian Orthodoxy by the Russian Orthodox Church and the colonization of the so-called Nova Russia by the Russian Empire went hand in hand. And it's the same 2 centuries it happens. And it continued under the Soviet Union, certainly after World War II under Stalin and with the symphony with the Russian Orthodox Church. So in this respect, the model of decolonization is certainly applicable to the Russian Empire.
Thank you. We have now several questions in the Q&A, and I would like to somehow sort them because there are some questions that I think we probably can answer in one of the following sessions. And we have Maksym also raised his hand, but I will start with at least 2 questions from the chat which come earlier. The first question is from Courtney Jones. Most religious groups in Ukraine have Russian counterparts and that support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is it possible that the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations members support this law, so as Jose also stated, because they also fear being labeled Moscow churches if they fail to support the state policy towards the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? So this is the first question about why those other churches support this law. Could there be also this context of fighting with the accusation to be colonized churches? And the second question I would like to take is from Olena Bohdan, who asked directly to Jose Casanova. If I understand correctly, you see the law as justifiable in the context of decolonization and Russian aggression against Ukraine. When you say so, do you imply the general idea that we can justify a law limiting relations with religious organizations in Russia under the current context, or instead, do you imply a more specific statement that you read the law fully and you see no problems in the way it approaches the subject? Essentially, the question is whether your assessment of the situation relates to the general idea of such a law or to the specific law that was indeed adopted in August this year. Thank you. So 2 questions, maybe you could shortly answer.
To the first question, AUKRO is very different from the way in which religious pluralism is structured through the state. AUKRO was developed as a civil society organization not organized by the state, and it has functioned as such. It is very different, well, at least it's very different from the Russian model of a state basically control of religious minorities. In which there are basically a division of which one is the national religion, which ones are the historical religions, which therefore are permitted, and which ones are not historical religions that cannot be permitted in Russia. Such distinctions do not exist within AUKRO. All of them are equal. They all share the presidency that rotates, and therefore it's a very different model of religious freedom, and is not organized by the state, even if it was originally promoted by the state. As to the second question,
but Jose, if I may, the question is: would you say that the smaller religious communities support the law because they are afraid that they also could be accused to be colonized by Russia?
I don't think so. I mean, the way I've heard them is, at least when the way they defended religious freedom in Ukraine, against accusations of religious persecution by Russia and by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, all of them, the Muslims, the Jews, the Pentecostals particularly, made very clear that they see the situation in Ukraine is radically different situation in Russia, that they want this situation to continue. Again, as to what the actual outcome, my point is I'm still hopeful that the outcome of the it's a problematic legislation, it's misguided, it's unfortunate. I don't defend the legislation, but the point is the task is not to basically, again, attack the legislation as curtailing religious freedom, but working to make sure that there is still a possibility of a solution that can be found to the crisis. And so this is to Elena, I would say, I'm not sure how the outcome is going to be. I'm a pragmatist on these matters. I don't believe in the absolute character of religious freedom over other processes. All of things have to be negotiated pragmatically to find the best possible solution. I don't find formal, ideal, theoretical positions which have to be defensible at any cost. I really think that we must find pragmatic solutions to the crisis in Ukraine. And I don't know what will be and what it will take, but I hope that all the religious groups involved and all the politicians, and also I would say global orthodoxy has a very, very serious responsibility to become involved in mediating the crisis.
Thank you. I would now take the question from Maksym and then add one question from the Q&A. Maksym.
Thank you. It seems my question is answered by both presenters. I just want to highlight this point that Catherine mentioned and now Jose mentioned. We cannot, we do not know to what extent this law will be implemented. We don't know will government go to this final stage by suiting some of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church bodies and force them to be liquidated, because we have this example of previous law about renaming the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and this law was not implemented by now. That's why I agree that maybe this we have consider the real intent of the government. If from one side we hear a lot that government wants to cut ties with the Russian Orthodox Church, and if it is a real intent of the government, probably we can find this compromise solution, as Jose mentioned, some solution from negotiations, which can lead to some kind of opportunity to preserve the legal status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. If you, if I get you correct, Catherine, you can add to this point. Thank you.
I would just add that I think from a multitude of perspectives, I mean, the situation is highly regrettable, and it's unfortunate that this law had to be or was written. In part, had the Orthodox Church of Ukraine reacted in a somewhat different way, perhaps this law might have been written in a different way. What I tried to say in my presentation was, I do believe laws should be written with the intention of being implemented, and they should not be symbolic. They should be functional. And it's unclear. I agree with Maksym, gave many details there as to what it's difficult to envision, especially under conditions of war and shortage of time and resources and the like, how this kind of costly, unwieldy process will actually unfold. But I do believe that laws should be written in such a way that they are clear and fair and readily implementable. We have an incredibly complex and difficult situation, and I see this law as sort of an attempt to provoke the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to react the way, and this goes back to Courtney's question, virtually every other religious organization in Ukraine has voluntarily reacted, and that is to say, to state in very unequivocal terms their commitment to Ukraine and their rejection of Russian aggression. I believe those religious minorities did that of their own will, out of their own conviction, and did not do it out of fear of being shamed or named or any other kind of reason. And I think we'll see where this law takes us. We're at a very pivotal, critical juncture.
Thank you.
If I may add, I do not like neither the letter nor the spirit of the law. I don't like the discourse of a spiritual national security doctrine. I don't like because it is a theory that comes out of basically imperial national security doctrines that are basically very, very dangerous. And I understand the national insecurity of Ukraine, but let's not transfer national security doctrines, which are basically developed by imperial powers, to abuse their power, not use this discourse to precisely present the need to protect Ukraine from aggression.
We have other questions, but we also have two sections tackling some parts of those questions now, about the exceptional situation of war and about the relations between the two churches and the question of autocephaly and dependence and so on. I would like to close with two short questions which are also very, very concrete directed. It's one from the Q&A about the comparison. Wouldn't be the Russian Orthodox Church presence in Ukraine be a better equivalent to the Church of England in America? Because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in fact, did try to go away from the Russian Orthodox Church, to detach from the Russian Orthodox Church. The Council of Ukrainian Orthodox Church adopted a new statute. Yeah, the question would be, is the comparison right to compare the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the Church of England in America? And the second question from Natalia Vasilievich is about the question about the Ukrainian part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So she points also with a quote of George Florovsky he considered that during imperial time, the Russian Orthodox Church was intellectually colonized from the Western Russian Church. Also, many observers insisted that Russian Church, including bishops level, in Soviet times was overpopulated by persons of Ukrainian origin. So can we really insist that the colonization model in Orthodoxy can be really applied to relations between Russia and Ukraine? So a fundamental question about how colonization is an appropriate frame at all for our discussion. Two very short answers.
Two very short answers. I believe context really matters. And in other words, one needs to look at the context in a particular time, in a particular place. Many, many things have changed in the 250 years that have transpired since that initial reckoning with what to do with the Church of England in the early American colonies when it was engaged in a war of independence from England. The stakes are entirely different for Ukraine now at this particular moment. Going back to Natalia's question, I think, in fact, two things can be true at the same time because, once again, context matters. I think one can point to many times in the past when, in fact, it's true. There were significant numbers of Ukrainians that rose to leadership positions within the Russian Orthodox Church. And there were one can point to many different kinds of adjustments that were made in religious life that were born in Ukraine and spread to other aspects of the Russian Orthodox Church. So this is one of the many reasons where we have sort of an atypical colonial kind of relationship and an atypical kind of relationship between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. However, at this particular moment in time, after 10 years of a hybrid war and almost going into 3 years of a full-scale invasion, I believe that many people on the ground in Ukraine embrace a decolonizing model, and I think there are grounds to make that case. And it's unfolding in a multitude of spheres, and in the instance of this law, it is unfolding in an unfortunate way in the sphere of religion.
Obviously, comparative context doesn't mean that the situation is the same. It's precisely the context to understand how each of them is unique and different, and yet there are very important contexts comparatively that make it also important to understand. I mean, when I raise the US and Latin America, it's not to say this situation is the same, but look what happened to these colonial churches. They went through such trouble precisely because they were colonial churches, and it took them difficulty to decolonize themselves. So it took, that's what I'm saying. It is not that they are the same, but look at what happened to the Church of England in Virginia. But even look at Dublin today, the St. Patrick's Cathedral, I mean, the most important Catholic churches of England are still today churches of Ireland, are still today basically shrines of the Church of England in Ireland. So the extent to which colonization is still present today in buildings in Dublin. I mean, St. Patrick's Cathedral is an Anglican church and other very important historical buildings. And so this is part of the inheritance of colonialism.
So I thank you very much for this very intense discussion in our first round. And we are going, thanks again, especially to Jose and Catherine. And we are going directly to the second round and the second panel, which will be moderated by Dmytro, about the exceptional situation. So we are just continuing the discussion we had started now in this round. Thank you very much. And Dmytro.
Thank you so much, Regina. So panel 2, war as an exceptional situation for religious legislation. We have 2 speakers. First, Elizabeth Clark from Brigham Young University's International Center for Law and Religion Studies, and Marietta Wanner from University of Cambridge. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. War is an exceptional situation. Lives are on the line, decisions need to be made quickly, there's rough justice, and there is permissibly some limitation on constitutional rights. But the problem here is that under international human rights law, freedom of religion or belief is treated differently than many other human rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a binding treaty that Ukraine's a member of, has specifically bars derogation or sort of exceptions from freedom of religion or belief in times of emergency. It allows it for other rights, but not specifically for freedom of religion or belief. That's been explained in General Comment 22 that specifically means in times of national security. So even if it were one of the ones that allowed derogation, those still require a higher level than normal, a strict necessity. Now it's easy to say, oh, look, these are just technicalities, these are dreamy idealists, international human rights law, who cares? But I think it's really valuable because the drafters had just come through World War II. This is not idealism. They went through very carefully, thought this, weighed this, had people from a variety of backgrounds and countries, and concluded that freedom of religion and belief is indispensable to human dignity, and that it's never necessary to derogate from its protections. Now, part of that is because there are limitations on freedom of religion and belief inherent in the right. International law requires that any restrictions on freedom of religion belief be for one of a set number of purposes. And here the relevant ones would be public order, like a concrete sense of public disturbances, or security of the person, protection of individual lives, right? Not a vague sense of national security or even an idea of what a country should be. It has to be to protect against public disturbances or protection of individual lives. In addition, restrictions on freedom of religion and belief have to be necessary in a democratic society. European Court of Human Rights explained this means that there's a pressing social need. The justifications must be relevant and sufficient. So as both a matter of rule of law and logic, restrictions on freedom of religion and belief can't be necessary if they're overbroad, ineffective, regulate thoughts and beliefs or potential harms instead of concrete illegal actions, if they discriminate on the basis of beliefs, if they punish groups for the actions of only some of its members or for actions out of their control, or if the punishments are disproportionate to the offenses. Now, much more can be said here. I'm going to take it really short because I know my time is about up. The case that's made that it's still necessary to be able to ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. One, as I understand it, it's necessary because of the criminality of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Right. And I think the concern I have with that is when you look at specifically how many convictions of Ukrainian Orthodox Church clerics there have been during the war. The best number I have is 43 out of a total of 2,425 convictions, which is 1.7% of all national security convictions in Ukraine. And it means that there's only 43 out of 10,000 clerics that were prosecuted, not the entire leadership, not the entire membership. So it's clearly overbroad, it's clearly disproportionate. The other argument I understand from necessity, this is where we heard some of this in the really fruitful and interesting discussion we had in the last session, the idea that it's necessary to cut ecclesiastical ties to an enemy state or to decolonize. Problem with that as a legal matter is that under international law, it's never necessary for the state to coerce groups to change their beliefs and doctrines. There's this idea of church autonomy, that religious organizations should be able to pick their own doctrines and beliefs, and it's not the state's role to come in and tell them to change it, even if part of that belief involves ecclesiastical ties with an enemy state. The state has the responsibility to punish concrete actions, not beliefs. Finally, I'll just say that the other reason I don't think the law is necessary is because it doesn't meaningfully advance public order, security of the person. There's already offenses that deal with the real harms here. Public denial of your Russian aggression, propaganda for the war, justification, legitimization, and non-public denial of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine or glorification of its participants, and spreading religious and ethnic hate. Those are sufficient to deal with the concrete offenses that are being carried out. So, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Marietta.
We can't hear you yet, Marietta.
Can
Marietta,
you
we
see
can't-
my screen
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, we see.
Excellent. Excellent. So my contribution is going to be about the Russian world as a geopolitical imaginary and how Ukraine's spiritual independence mirrors to that. Kathy and I already spoke about this earlier this week at the US Institute of Peace, and I'll do a short version of this in the next couple of minutes. So the Russian world as geopolitical imagination is very much a counterpart to the idea of the Pax Americana, or even in the Chinese version, the idea of all under the heavens. So this is about the rise of a multipolar world order and a different understanding of the world, a different understanding of order, and a different understanding of peace. And this means that the Russian world as such is an imaginary that has very concrete security content. However, the way that we then work around that in the law will have to be specific. I'll come to that in a minute. This imaginary is very much about space and spatial identity. It is contesting borders, and it is kind of overlaying a spiritual ought versus a political is. So there is borders, Ukraine is independent, but there is a spiritual story being told of that actually denies that Ukraine is in fact independent. Now, the imaginary of the Russian world is not a coherent narrative. I don't think it's meant to be a coherent narrative from a political perspective, but this is what makes lawyers very nervous when the language of the Russian world is used, because lawyers do, and the law do require a quite specific description of what one might call the legitimate aim, which in this case is about public order, as Elizabeth Clark has already mentioned. Now, these bridge frames that the Russian world builds on, I've put here on the screen. I'm not going to elaborate on them in great detail, but just highlighting sort of the binaries between religion and secularism, the idea of traditionalism versus LGBT rights and feminism, images of good and evil, a different conception of democracy between liberal democracy and illiberalism, an assertion against the West, against NATO, against EU institutions and Western philanthropy. There are concerns about a changing world order and the position of Russia within that. And then what we've seen is that these discourses do have an openness to a transnational far right. So what does this mean for the purposes of defining the Russian world? Well, it becomes very difficult. I think what I would like to suggest is the Russian world itself functions as what we call a bridge frame. And a bridge frame is an idea or a notion that you use that is so vague or so abstract that you can use to appeal to a wide range of audiences. So I've listed a couple of possible audiences for the Russian world. So the religious discourse, traditionalist discourse, civilizational discourse, extremist discourse, and transnational right-wing discourse. These are very different discourses, and it means that what the Russian world means might also be slightly different depending on who you're talking to. Now, to then come to the idea of the spiritual independence of Ukraine, is that in the draft laws that have been discussed over the last couple of years, there have been several references, broad references to the war, broad references to the Russian world. And actually, this is one of the reasons why legal critique is so strong, because one has to justify such measures on specifically articulated grounds. And this is very difficult when you're working with a notion that it is itself so vacuous and so flexible. Now, the response has been very much from Russia, that Ukraine persecutes Christians. I think that is grossly overstated. But there's also very real geopolitical risks to this religious freedom frame, which we see translated in sort of the discussion around military support and continued military support for Ukraine. So the question then is really how useful is both the idea of spiritual independence and the idea of the Russian world. I think at the moment, both the Russian world and the idea of spiritual independence are notions that are not sufficiently familiar to a Western legal audience. And this makes it very hard to use this framework in a way that is going to be recognized under the European Court of Human Rights, for example, but also under other bodies of international law. However, should the discourse around the Russian world crystallize out further, which I think is possible, it might very well be recognized as a function of public order in its characteristic as a security issue. Now, this is not a religious thing per se, this is a security thing per se, and this could possibly come under public order. But even if it does, what will need to happen is that there's a very concrete link made between particular actions that are being criminalized and the frameworks of the Russian world. And again, it is that sufficiently concrete link that has so far been missing from the draft laws. Doesn't mean they cannot be articulated, but they do need to be articulated. And then the question also arises if this is really an additional circumstance when people might refer to the Russian world, when in principle the action that is outlawed is actually criminal for everyone, regardless of the reason why they might engage in that activity. So you might want to rely on a more general law. So I think what is important here is that this idea of the Russian world can function as a security issue, but it needs to be further further specified, and it also needs to be linked in a very concrete way to particular activities. Now, those activities so far have been quite broad. There will be other strategies. I will put my email address in here for those who might want to be in touch about that, which might have to do with the securitization of some minorities elsewhere in Europe. I'm thinking of Muslims in France, for example. Not that I think the strategies of the French government have always been fruitful. However, there are frameworks developed in other countries that deal with foreign influence and that are currently accepted under the European Convention of Human Rights. So that's a conversation to be explored. I think I should draw a line on my presentation here, so we've got some time for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marietta. We already have a couple of questions or 3 questions in the chat, and I'll start with the question from Lauren Homer. Lauren is surprised that there is not a focus on the fact that the Russian Church and some Ukrainian Orthodox Church support the Russian world concept, which provides that Ukraine and Belarus does not exist as a state, and that Ukrainians and Belarusians are not a legitimate ethnic group. They're a subgroup of Russians. The Russian Church has set up indoctrination camps in occupied Ukraine. This is a genocidal policy far beyond colonialism. Do the speakers agree that Ukraine can shut down a religious group engaged in anti-state activities? And I'm asking you to keep your questions, as quick, as short as possible. Who wants to start, Marietta or Elizabeth, please? Marietta.
Sure. I think what is important is that when we think about the ways in which these laws are framed, we have to sort of think very carefully about how the law is talked about and what's actually written in the law. So even though the language that is often used in the media and in political discourse is about an entire church being banned, that's actually quite difficult to achieve even under the legislation that has been passed. Partially because the past tense is not quite accurate so long as the legal procedure has not been completed. So the church is not yet banned. And the question is even if that shall happen. Now, normally, again, you might target specific activities, even when you have concerns about the content of sermons or when you have concerns about the content of literature that's being shared, or maybe intelligence-related activities that have got very little to do with the liturgy. Those are specific activities that you can target in the law without speaking about a denomination as a whole. And I think in many ways, this religious freedom frame, again, has been super useful in the transnational discourse because it's very hard to explain in 3 sentences quite how complex the law is and in which ways it may or may not be effective. But the reality is also that these laws change over time. Like when countries go through periods of instability, we often see that they adopt several laws on religion, not just on religion, sometimes even entire constitutions before these things settle down. So I see these draft laws and also the law that was voted on over the summer as part of that process. I don't think it's the end point. If anything, it might be the starting point or somewhere in the middle. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Thanks, Marietta. I agree that this may be, hopefully, one of several steps. I think that as far as the question from Lauren goes, if there's arguments that Ukraine is not a legitimate society, if there's indoctrination camps, if there's propaganda for the war, I mean, if you're using Russian world in a specific enough a way that it justifies the war or is propaganda for the war, all those are already criminalized. I think they are problematic, but I'm not sure that the new law really does much to advance the protections for those.
Thank you. And next question from Natalia Vasilevich. I would also like to draw attention that people who were accused in crimes against national security from the side of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church are often unjustly repressed for their other activities. As an example, Father Mykola Danilevich, who is already since April 2024 under investigation and cannot leave the country and even his city, not to write in social media. Also an example of Dialog Tut website of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was simply banned in Ukraine, although no independent observer could find any evidence of criminal activities. So we can clearly see that there is a clear repressions from different agencies of Ukraine against personalities and projects of the Ukrainian Church, which cannot find any legitimization. Elizabeth, would you like to comment on that? And then Marietta.
Yeah. No, I'd be happy to. I think that's one of my concerns with the law is it functions as been described as sort of a symbolic effort. But the problem with symbolic laws is that there is the signaling problem, right? They're signaling to local officials that it's all right to be discriminatory, that the government is not going to offer traditional rule of law protections to this group. And so I think you're seeing that already in local activities happening where things that are clearly illegal or discriminatory are happening, and those are problematic. They're not obviously a direct result of the law, but I think it's a very clear signal from the law.
Marietta.
Yes, thank you. I was just reading over the question again. As I said, I don't think it is accurate to say that the church has already been banned. There's a possibility of certain branches of the church getting into trouble, but this again depends on a long political procedure to be completed before we can talk about this in the past tense. I think in general, it is completely to be expected that there is social anxiety around groups that are perceived to be loyal to foreign powers. I mean, it doesn't take much imagination to think about the way that Catholics, for example, were regarded in Europe in the last 150 years as ultramontanes, as you know, when it comes to it, they were loyal to the Pope. And this was by many European states also seen as a very real security issue. So I think what we need to sift out is, on the one hand, the perception that people might have, and now this translates in popular intolerance, the way in which the law then gets used for individual cases, and then the way that the law is used to regulate religion as a sort of broader category. I think we cannot simply equate all those instances. I think that is, at least from a legal perspective, bit of intellectual laziness. However, it's very understandable that when people read about these accounts, it sort of becomes this one thing around, you know, how welcome is this church still in Ukraine? And I think as those who are trained in law, I think we need to make an effort to keep explaining how these spaces of regulation are different, how they develop over a period of time within their context, and that yes, we can critique them when they go too far, but it doesn't mean that we sort of paint with a broad brush and say it's all equally problematic, because some of the issues do need to be dealt with, and this might have to do with intelligence related activity. It might have to do with the way in which the church is actively used. I mean, it's not an accident, I think, that the church is so useful as a possible agent for Russia, or at least Russia might see it in that way, because it can rely on religious freedom to do things that it might otherwise not be able to do, because it will come up to the limits of the law earlier. But the question is, how receptive is the church actually to perhaps a desire that we might suspect on behalf of the Russian authorities? And again, there we will have to take a case-to-case approach to sift out the cases that are pure perception and the cases that are actually based on evidence.
Thank you. I'm going to take all blaming from Pavlo Smytsnyuk and Maksym Vasin, because we will take one question from Jose and one question from Q&A, and then we will close the session due to the time limits. Jose, the floor is yours.
An added complication is the existence of ecclesiastical canon law, which adds the Ruski Mir is not only an imperial secular ideology that says that the territory of Ukraine has no right to be independent of Russia completely, but canon law tells the Russian Orthodox Church that Ukraine is its canonical territory. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine has not challenged this claim of the Russian Orthodox Church that Ukraine is the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Thank you, Jose. And the final round of questions. First to Marietta from Bortnyk and Metreveli. What specific elements of the Russian world ideology qualify it as a matter of public order rather than cultural or ideological expressions? Bortnyk is slightly confused here. And a question to Elizabeth. You mentioned that ICCPR, if I'm not mistaken, is a part of international human rights instruments related to freedom of religion or belief, which bar derogation of these freedoms, including in times of war. Are there been any mention or measures by the United Nations or other intergovernmental bodies regarding the new law or current situation related to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine? Marietta.
Thank you, Dmytro. So first on canonical jurisdiction, I mean, even when you look at various European states, several churches have different forms of their jurisdiction where they don't necessarily match up with the country's border. That's not unprecedented in Europe. The question is, what does the law think of those competing claims to space? And this is where the conversation about the Russian world really comes in, because it is a competition of space that's not just religious or cultural. It is really one that is geopolitical. It is denying Ukraine's independent statehood. It is supportive of military action in several quite concrete examples. The most recent one that was most obvious was Patriarch Kirill's involvement with the statement of the war being a holy war, which is interesting because nobody could talk about this as a war, much less so about it being a holy war. So this is indicative. I think when we look at the Russian world as a geopolitical phenomenon, it's not about religion per se, because the Russian world could even function without its religious content in its geopolitical form, in that it challenges borders, in that it is trying to conceive of a different kind of world order, in a multipolar world order that we call it today, in which America, Russia, and China vie for not just who's number one and number two, but also, you know, nobody wants to be number three for sure. So in the Chinese case, it has to do with the notion of Jianxia, again, a notion that one can use in a spiritual way, but doesn't have to use in a spiritual way. And insofar as we talk about the Russian world from this geopolitical perspective as a different conception of world order, perhaps this is the most clear way in which it expresses security concerns, not just for Ukraine, by the way, I think also for Europe, for NATO, of course, for America and American foreign policy. I'm sure they are scratching their head over this as well. And I think in the Western world, we have been on the back foot because we've not really grasped the bridge frame narrative of the Russian world. We've been so busy saying, is this religious or is this not religious? Is this just civilizational talk? Does this mean anything more than just a couple of values? But in fact, it is a different conception of order and peace and a different conception of world making. So I think that's something that we have to take more seriously than we have perhaps done. It doesn't mean it needs to get the immediate legal sort of consequence, because it might take a long time for that to crystallize. But I think from a political perspective, the security dimensions of the Russian world are not to be underestimated.
And final comment from Elizabeth.
Sure. As to the question about the under the ICCPR and whether there's other bodies, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has expressed concerns about the new law. Those are available online. And to Jose Casanova's question, I guess coming as a lawyer to this question, I would say that canon law should be irrelevant. I mean, it's not irrelevant for lots of purposes, but in purpose for criminal law, as purpose of state regulation, it should be. It's a purely internal legal religious doctrine. It's very clear part of understanding of religious freedom. that internal religious doctrines are the province of the religions and they're not the province of the state. I mean, this is an idea that's developed over hundreds of years that has been really well implemented in Ukraine up until now, and has been, you know, I would argue, an important part of how Ukraine has flourished. That Jews, Protestants, others have felt, Catholics have felt safe and comfortable. And that comes from a strong rule of law commitment to the principle of religious freedom. It's not something that you can make an exception for here, an exception for there, and still have a vibrant commitment to it that upholds the rule of law. And I think rule of law is so valuable and such a part of what Ukraine has been and is trying to be as part of a member of a rules-based world order, as part of the Western system. I think undermining it is really problematic and self-defeating.
Thank you so much to both speakers, but also many thanks for your thought-provocative questions. I'm now thinking that actually Belarusian people in one of the questions is a colonizational name, because the self-name will be Belarus people, which means that we have connections to different sessions. But this session is over, and I'm giving the floor to Thomas for the next session.
Thank you. So we immediately start, because we are running short of time, with the third panel, which is in which Dmytro actually changes his role. He is now a panelist. Dmytro Vovk is a visiting professor in the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law in New York City. And the other speaker is Maksym Vasin, whom we saw already in the discussion, who is the executive director of the Institute of Religious Freedom in Ukraine. And this panel will discuss the law as a legal text. It was already raised by some of the speakers in the two other panels that the formulations and the text of the law 3894 is a little bit problematical, and we want to hear more about that from legal scholars. So please, Dmytro, go ahead.
Thank you, Thomas. This is probably the most boring session, and this is the story of my life, because we are going to discuss a purely this lawyerish stuff. Just a second. So one of the key legal philosophers of the 20th century, Lon L. Fuller, developed the concept of the internal morality of law. According to Fuller, all legal rules must meet 8 minimal conditions in order to count as genuine laws. The rules must be, first, sufficiently general, second, publicly promulgated, third, prospective, applicable only to future behavior, fourth, at least minimally clear and intelligible, free of contradiction, six, relevantly constant, seven, possible to obey, and 8, there should be congruence between the declared goal of the law and its application. If a piece of legislation fits these principles or standards, according to Fuller, it complies at least minimally with the rule of law. The law under discussion does not comply, in my view, at least with 3 of the above-mentioned principles. First of all, the law is not clear and precise enough in many aspects. For example, the law stipulates that any violation regarding the establishment and operation of a religious organization affiliated with Russia is a ground for its ban. Formally, it means that even a mistake or typo regarding the address of the organization or its founders can be a ground for its liquidation. The definition of so-called Russian world ideology is also very broad and vague, that things like commemoration of Russian medieval priests or claims of a shared spiritual history with Russia, or even the theology of criticizing European way of Ukraine's development can be ground for imposing a ban. This is also true for the concept of affiliation with the Russian Orthodox Church is the main ground of the banning religious organizations. The state can, but is not required, by the way, to conduct an expert examination to determine a link with Russia. And even if the state decides to conduct such an expert examination, experts can be appointed by the state with no requirements to their impartiality or qualification. And And as we can see from a similar expert examination already conducted in 2023, the Ukrainian government has no problem with appointing experts with no clear expertise in Orthodox theology or even with membership in the competing church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or even state employees. Second, the law is ultimately not possible to obey in the sense that there is nothing that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church can do to 100% avoid the ban. The law prescribes that religious organizations affiliated with Russia must cut all ties with the Russian Church. However, the criteria of affiliation makes it very clear that as long as the Russian Church recognizes the Ukrainian Church as its own branch, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will remain affiliated. Thus, ultimately, the execution of the law depends on the Russian Church and its documents rather than on the actions of Ukrainian religious organizations subjected to this regulation. And I think we can safely say the Russian Church will never recognize the independence of the Ukrainian Church. And third, there is no congruence between the declared goal of the law and its application. The declared goal is to cut ties between the Ukrainian religious organizations and Russia for the sake of national security. However, the law does not strengthen national security in any meaningful way, at least if we think national security in political and military terms. It rather responds to Ukraine's society or its most active part, identitarian expectations. The law seems to be a gift to Russian propaganda, which will utilize the law to promote the idea of so-called religious persecutions in Ukraine. But what is even more important, the law has already provoked concerns from a variety of international actors, human rights defenders, international organizations, churches, and religious groups across the globe. And it's not just top political level organizations, it's also many grassroots organizations. In the midst of the war, but also at the starting point of the European integration of Ukraine, these concerns are definitely not what Ukraine needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmytro, also for being so short, and I give the floor immediately to Maksym.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the invitation to join this discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to consider this issue from different angles. I agree with Dmytro conclusion that the law is not perfect, and most of the criticism regarding the requirements of international law is fair. The law has many shortcomings that make its implementation somewhat unpredictable. Much depends on what kind of requirements for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church the government will issue and what the church will do in response. Besides, when assessing this law, it is essential to remember that we are not talking about a peaceful country like Estonia, which discuss similar legislation now. Instead, there is a existential threat for Ukrainian people and a real war going on in Ukraine. Therefore, the Ukrainian government cannot ignore the numerous facts of Russians' interference in the internal affairs of Ukrainian religious organization. In recent years, the Russian Orthodox Church has been actively interfering in the leadership and the structure of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. For example, it has annexed about a dozen dioceses in the occupied territories of Ukraine and created, for example, the Crimean Metropolitanate instead of several dioceses in Crimea. Moreover, some of the Ukrainian bishops of these dioceses, such as Metropolitan Lazar Shvets and Metropolitan Ilarion Shukalo, who were previously appointed in Kiev, were recently dismissed to retirement in Moscow. The Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church appointed Russian bishops instead. However, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church silently accepted these changes made in Moscow. Furthermore, these dismissed Ukrainian bishops who were collaborators and devotedly served the Russian authorities are still identified as hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on its official website. there has been no single statement of condemnation and no church disciplinary actions. The adopted law applies to any other Russian religious center that support Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine. For example, the Russian United Fellowship of Christians of the Evangelical Faith may be also banned. It is headed by Bishop Serhii, who has been a repeated of Kremlin propaganda for many years and expanded his influence on the territories of Ukraine occupied by Russia. The Russian authorities demand that local Ukrainian evangelical churches directly subordinate to the Russian religious centers under the threat of a ban and confiscation of church property. The Russian military has already banned dozens of churches in eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, ironically because of their lack of ties to the Russian religious centers. Obviously, it is critical for Russia to control and use every church in its war against Ukraine. In my opinion, when we talk about the dangerous influence of the Russian religious centers on Ukrainian society, it is not always, even rarely, connected with the criminal offenses. However, religious influence is important for Russia because it allows Russia to spread disinformation and propaganda at the grassroots levels, from person to person. This can be even more difficult to regulate than the activities of media outlets that may also be banned, such as Russia Today. It is necessary to discuss how the state can respond to the involvement of the church in spreading disinformation, for example, when talking about a civil conflict instead of Russian aggression against Ukraine. The new law has not yet liquidated the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but only provided for this measure as a last resort if the church does not comply with the government's instructions to sever ties with the Russian Orthodox Church permanently. Unfortunately, we do not know the content of the governmental instructions now, but they should not include requirements that are obviously impossible to fulfill, which Dmytro mentioned. For example, one of my proposals is that by May 2025, the parliament has to introduce an amendment stating that the government and courts should not use the impossible requirements of disaffiliation as a basis for liquidation a legal entity. I agree with other presenters that none of us knows for sure whether the issue will really come to the point where the Ukrainian government will go to court to liquidate the Kyiv Metropolitanate, some compromised dioceses, or some local communities of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We can only predict how this law will be implemented. But the court decision is only the final stage provided by the law as a last resort. Two other stages preceded. The first is when the state service, governmental body finds signs of affiliation with the Russian religious center and sends an instruction order to a Ukrainian religious organization to eliminate the identified shortcomings. This should be a plan of specific actions to be taken as required by the law. However, if the first instruction, first order is not fulfilled or partially fulfilled, then the government may designate the affiliation with the Russian religious center, issue the second instruction, and go to court. Fulfilling the government requirements at any stage will allow the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to continue to operate freely and legally in Ukraine. Therefore, I would like to propose that during our further discussion, we cover the questions of what precisely the parliament and the government of Ukraine should do to make it possible for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to implement this law and achieve its primary goal of getting rid of Russian interference in its internal church affairs. And what exactly should the Ukrainian Orthodox Church do to demonstrate that final and irreversible break of ties with the Russian Orthodox Church and prevent the unwanted scenario of liquidation its government structures? Thank you.
Thank you, Maksym, for this contribution. We have one question in the chat, and I would maybe add a question which somehow disappeared, which we had earlier in the chat. So let me ask two questions, and then I give you the chance to answer. The first was, if I remember, whether like the events in Cherkasy, which happened last week or so, can be seen as already a consequence of the law. I mean, we know that the law foresees a 9 months time before it can become, because actions can be taken, but people use that, people on the ground in the provinces use that as an argument. The UOC is forbidden, so we can take action now. So what would be your reaction on that? And the second question is by Bertnett Jones. How can you claim that the UOC silently accepted the Russian Orthodox Church's incursions in its territories? Metropolitan Onufry has explicitly said, quote, "These are our dioceses, these are our people," end quote, and the UOC Center has no contact with them presently, but expects to be reunited with them in a, quote, "united independent Ukraine," end quote. So please react to these two questions.
So let me start. First of all,
sorry. Yes, okay. I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay. So regarding the 9 months time that we still have, because the court procedure will come in force in May. Well, first of all, this is a bit misleading, because the law has already come into force. The law has already been implemented. And it's not just about banning religious organizations. The law also prescribes that if religious organizations are recognized as affiliated, they will have no right to lease or rent state or municipally owned properties, which is a lion's share part of church buildings that the UOC has, which means that in a couple of months, hypothetically, but very realistically, those communities will lose their properties, which in many ways, they're on the property. This is the first point. The second point regarding Cherkasy, I don't think that it's a consequence of the law itself, but it's the consequence of the whole discussion over the law. Because yes, the law and previous discussion and sort of interventions by Ukrainian politicians, has already signaled that, you know, this is Russian Church, that, you know, we must do something with them. And then we have Cherkasy, and we have a sort of quite violent transition. But it's not just about violent transition, it's also about legal mess around this transition. Because now we have, after the decision of the Ukrainian Supreme Court, we have actually a legal position that any 10 people can constitute a local parish, which means that any 10 people can get together at any place and decide to transition any church or any religious community from one church to another. And this is what probably happened in Cherkasy. The cathedral that was transitioned is actually, as I understand, was a private property. So the actual transitioned private property to different people, to different community. We also see that the state either reluctant or has no power to control this violence, which the state prefers, you know, to stay aside and see how the things will go on. And for Ukrainian state, which is still very weak, which is still deinstitutionalized, which is still privatized, it's very bad tendency. Because if the violence is growing, that situation that the state can't control will be even more evident.
I agree with Dmytro that we have a very high intensity of this discussion in Ukrainian society, which cause sometimes violations, which we see in Cherkasy. And it is obvious that the police didn't prevent this violence. And also I see that there is a lack of information from the government how this law will be implemented, what will be going on next month, because some media already stated that the law is it became enforced, and that's why whole parishes of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate should be banned. But it is not true, because before the even termination of the lease agreements, the government, the state service should make a decision about affiliation with the Russian Orthodox Church. There is no such decision, such religious expertise, such any kind of orders to disaffiliate, and that's why I see a lack of information in Ukrainian society how to respond to this law.
Thomas, if I may, just
Thank
one
you.
quick,
Yeah.
one quick point. Well, it's not completely true, I would say, because the government has already conducted an expertise, religious examination. It was done in 2023. The conclusion of the examination was very concrete. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is the part of the Russian Church. Nothing, completely nothing has changed since then. I also think that the government will just reissue the same expert examination, and we see signals from the government that it will happen in that way. We have several commentaries from these people, which means that it's not unclear. It's quite clear that the government perceives the church as a part of the Russian Church. What makes you think that that there is no decision, that still there should be some sort of procedures and so on and so forth? There should be some procedures, but the position of the government, in my view, is quite clear.
Yeah, I mean, the stages how this law should be implemented before any state body or local authorities terminate any lease agreement, they have to receive this new expertise or some kind of confirmation that they have to do some actions according to this law. And also I wonder what kind of instruction government will issue, what kind of order, what action plan they propose to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to break ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. For me, it is important to know, is it possible for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to fulfill these instructions, these government requirements, and to preserve its legal status and operate freely in Ukraine?
Thank you. As far as I see, there are already demands by the State Service for Religion, what the UOC should do. Like Zelensky has already made statements about it. But now we have Casey Wanner with a question or contribution, please.
So this is a sort of a follow-up to what we're talking about, and I would appreciate it. This is one thing I've long wondered about, and perhaps you two could illuminate us. Especially you, Maksym, you spoke about the very extensive ways in which the government is involved in this process of establishing whether or not an affiliation exists. We all know legally it's much more difficult to prove a negative than it is to prove a positive, given that there are infinite ways in which could be affiliated. Is that a concern on your part? And I want to relate this back to an issue that came up in the last session about criticisms of this law targeting a collective when in fact we have actions of a specific few individuals. Do we see when we get to the level of parishes where perhaps specific individuals might do something that indicates a connection of sorts with the Russian Orthodox Church, but perhaps the parish does not? So in other words, are we replicating the punishment of the collective based on the actions of a few on the parish level here when it comes to specific forms of affiliation?
I agree that it would be the better way to persecute some church leaders who did some criminal offenses, state treason or something else. In this case, I completely agree with all concerns which Dmytro mentioned about international law and also Elizabeth mentioned. But I also see this situation like opportunity for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to make some clear actions to fulfill this law and to close this question, to respond question from the Ukrainian society. That's it is okay. We are Ukrainian church, and we are with Ukrainian people, and we broke all ties with the Moscow, and it could be helpful to this church to make such clear statements. But from other side, I agree that Russia, for Russia, it will be more beneficial if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will be persecuted and will be a ground to condemn the Ukrainian government, to deprive Ukraine from international military support and so on. That's why I agree with Dmytro that it is not the best way to respond this national security issue. That's why I hope that the government will not force this law to be implemented in this extreme scenario, like liquidation of the structural bodies of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but to force this church to make some clear acts to become clearly Ukrainian church.
Okay, thank you. I will take one short question. I think it's very simple to answer it. One of two of you, by Nadezhda Belyakova. How does the provision of the statute of the Russian Orthodox Church relate to the statute of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which calls it autonomous with broad governance rights? So the relationship between these two canonical texts or church law texts. Who wants to give a short answer?
The Russian Orthodox Church statute relates in the way that it's one of criteria of the affiliation. The fact that the Russian Orthodox Church statute mentions the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or any other document of the Russian Orthodox Church mentions the Ukrainian Church, or Patriarch Kirill blesses any clerics of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, is the ground to recognize the church as Ukrainian Church as affiliated with Russia according to the law. This is the main problem with affiliation, because this affiliation relies more on the document on the Russian Church than actions of the Ukrainian Church. I agree with Maksym that yes, the church should be much significantly more vocal for example, in condemning priests involved in the illegal activities. But the sense is, formally speaking, from the perspective of the law, it's actually doesn't change the situation, doesn't make any difference. Because as long as the Russian Church recognizes the Ukrainian Church as its part, the state will have a tool to recognize the Ukrainian Church as affiliated with Russia.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It is the main issue of this law that some criteria of affiliation could not be fulfilled by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and I hope the Parliament will make some amendments, but it is so weak hope.
Thank you. We have to conclude here. Thank you very much for the questions, for your answers, for your short presentations. We have now a break, which we will reduce to 15 minutes because of the late time. So we meet again in 15 minutes, which is 12:55 in New York, 5:55 in Berlin, and 6:55 in Kiev. I hope you will all be back then. Thank you and have a nice break.
So our next session, panel 4, it's about the dialogue. The name of the title of the session, Push to Dialogue, Can the Law Support Interchurch Relations? We have 2 presenters. The first, Pavlo Smytsnyuk, affiliated with George Washington University Eliot School of International Affairs. And our second presenter is Regina Elsner, professor of University of Münster. I think there is a possibility that Pavlo is still joining us. Pavlo? So we'll probably start with Regina, and I will be sending messages to Pavlo following Regina remarks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so I would like to make 2 points on this question. First, I think that the first question in the framework of religious freedom would be not if the law can support interchurch relations, but if a law should support or should be intended to support interchurch relations. And so my answer would be clearly no, it should not. A law should not try to impact the relations of diverse groups within one religion, at least in a secular political system. The question which moved different denominations to separation, so the situation we have in Christian world, that we have different denominations and that they have different reasons to be in separation. So these reasons are always multi-layered. There are theological questions, cultural questions, political questions, and so on. And in many ways, the question of identity is in the very heart of the separation. Not only the question how to define one's identity, but also how to defend one's identity. And the question, can a law resolve the question of identity? And I would rather doubt it. The confessional situation in Ukraine has never been easy, but for a rather long time Ukraine succeeded in securing a legal framework which allowed the different churches to discuss their differences and find their mode of relations in a rather safe space. They used this space differently with different success, but it was never sanctioned politically, and it never had the political or legal consequences how the churches related to each other. The Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations has already been mentioned before, and I would like to disagree with José that this is a purely civil organization. It was established by political actors, and it is an instrument of political strategies. But what is more important here in this discussion, so far all churches, all religious organizations in the council have been equal. It was never a question of canonical or ecclesial recognition to be part of this council. The religious communities were never forced to discuss their mutual relations. They were never forced to discuss theological questions, questions of faith and truth. And it was never an ecumenical platform. But of course, and this is important, the council gave the opportunity to representatives of churches to share one room, to sit on one table, to talk, and to build trust. Neither the council nor the legislation decided about questions of true or false religion. The new law, and especially the preparation process, and I would also strongly recommend not to separate the law and the process which led to this law and the discussions which accompanied the law. So these both, the law and the process, changed this approach extremely. The law and the discourse in support of the law allows now to delegitimate religious communities because of their teaching. We talked about canon law. It allows the government to decide which community is right and wrong. In terms of ecumenical dialogue, such an approach is disastrous from my point of view because it nurtures mistrust and the hermeneutics of suspicion, and both are toxic to ecumenism per se. This brings me to the second point, which returns to José's statement in the beginning that the law nevertheless can be potentially fruitful. Yes, we have already seen unprecedented encounters between different church representatives, the ecumenical patriarchate representatives and Metropolite Onufri. Yes, the law can probably push communities or individuals to agree to talks which they had not agreed before. However, if these talks would not have happened without the law, then the intrinsic motivation is not the openness for dialogue, but is fear. Understanding the deep and historically rooted mistrust between the three major churches in Ukraine, fear might be the worst advisor of all. Also, the law pushes only one side, putting the other churches, which are not pushed for dialogue, in a position of superiority and power. All these aspects, mistrust, suspicion, force, inequality, and fear, make it very likely that interchurch relations, which are built on such a foundation, will cause much more harm and conflict rather than opening a real space for constructing new and sustainable relations between the churches. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. And now the floor is to Pavlo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I will leave the legal issues aside and focus on interchurch relations. And I would like to address three questions. The first on relations between two branches of Ukrainian Orthodoxy. Can the new law lead to the reinstatement of unity between two branches of Ukrainian Orthodoxy? Yes, this is something Regina tried to address. And the second and third questions would regard the relations between Ukrainian churches and religions. So one question would be, why do they support the law? And the third question, what effects the law might have on the interchurch relations in Ukraine? So can the new law lead to a reinstatement of unity? I think from the declarations of some state officials, it would seem that the aim of the law would be to bring those two churches to unity. Now, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, UOC, faces three choices: to remain in the ambiguous state it is now of nezalezhnyst but not of autocephaly, and perhaps take some steps which were suggested by the state service of ethnicities and nationalities in a letter to Metropolitan Clement and Archbishop Silvestre. The second solution would be to proclaim autocephaly or to unite with OCU. I think all of the steps present risks, but I think that the unity with Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which might be the soundest step from a canonical point of view, is very unlikely because of the level of mistrust between the two churches. If the Orthodox Church of Ukraine desires such a development, it should be preparing the ground, maybe imposing a moratorium on the criticism of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, declaring readiness to consider some of the issues raised by UOC, etc. But there is no sign whatsoever that this is happening. On the contrary, the violence that we can see sometimes is a sign that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine views the other jurisdiction as an enemy, not as a sister church. The second question, why all other churches and religious organizations supported this law? Like, I was astonished to see this unanimity in the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. Like, I expected to see some more complex reactions from the church leaders. This didn't happen. Even, I think, Roman Catholic Church or Hungarian Reformed Church of Ukraine and some others have supported the law, or at least abstained from criticizing it. Why is that? I think first, they don't see this as limiting religious freedom, or at least their religious freedom. I think the story around the law would have been different if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church had managed to raise support among other churches, or made them at least sympathetic to their position. The other reason would be UOC's anti-ecumenical approach. Now, Ukrainian Catholics and Protestants have long time resented the fact that UOC has been a leader of anti-ecumenism in Ukraine, not only at the doctrinal level, but as a matter of its style. It was even more ecumenical than the rest of the Russian Orthodox Church. I think it became evident from when you try to understand why most of the churches and religions supported the autocephaly in 2019, but also from my experience working at Ecumenical Institute in Lviv. I think one of the sharpest critics of Patriarch Kirill's encounter with Pope Francis came from Ukraine, from one of the close collaborators of Metropolitan Onufry. Another reason might be ambiguity of UOC independence. As the primate of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has recently commented, if UOC really means that it is independent, let them show this to us and the law will not apply to them. Another reason, I think, has to do with the church-state relations in Ukraine in the context of war. I think in such exceptional circumstances, civil society is less inclined to go against government. This has been visible in the West during the war on terror, and I think it's visible in Ukraine now. And I think it is a genuine problem. I think it shows that Ukrainian religions are incapable of going beyond the logic of the state and state narratives. Now, I'm not arguing that Ukrainian religions are somewhat similar to Russian Orthodox Church, being an ideological instrument of the church, but I think that they are not very prophetic either. They often repeat the calls from Ukrainian government, civil society, and I think that the support of the ban, or the support of this law is a sign of this process. Now, to conclude my third question, what effects the law might have on the interchurch relations in Ukraine? And I think I agree a lot with Regina. I think it certainly depends on how the law gets implemented. If Ukrainian Orthodox Church parishes are being banned globally, I hope that at least Ukrainian Catholics and Protestants would protest and express gestures of solidarity toward UOC, and perhaps such act could change the anti-ecumenical style of the church. At the same time, I think evidence from post 9/11 shows that groups that are marginalized, they are more likely to have recourse to violence. We haven't seen this, but who knows? And the most important question is what will happen to Ukrainian pluralism if UOC disappears, either by being incorporated into the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or by being forced into clandestinity. I think this will be a radical transformation of religious situation in Ukraine. For the first time since its independence, it will have a dominant church with implication for the status of all other communities, whose life might become from one day to another dependent on the dominant church's willingness to be respectful and considerate. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. We are still waiting for your questions. You can send them to Q&A, and the first question will probably come from me, both to Pavlo and to Regina. In your view, what are incentives or motives for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine now to conduct the dialogue, or to keep the dialogue with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Because I understand the logic of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They might want to have some sort of dialogue in order to avoid the ban But what's the sense for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? It seems like for them it's more in terms of religious politics. This dialogue makes no sense because they're winning this battle.
Yes, this is I think what I meant by the law pushes only one side. It doesn't give the other side any motivation to really to understand why to open up for dialogue, because what we see by now, in my view, is that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine is just somehow using this law, so the leadership of the church at least, to say, come to us, we are the right church, and all the others have to comply to our ideas, to our strategies within this war, and so on. And they are not pushed equally or motivated, if you want so, to critically approach their own situation. And one of the decisive things in a dialogue, in the equal dialogue, which really wants to be open to each other, is to be self-critical. And so we have as churches a general problem with self-criticism, but in this situation even more. The Orthodox Church has so I don't see any motivation for them to now make really serious steps in the direction of openness, of being open to the other church. And the church that enforces this position of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine.
Pavlo, any take from you?
No, I agree with Regina. I see no way that this law can somehow bring two churches to dialogue as it is now, because trust is something you build over time, and there was no attempt on neither part to build trust. So the law, even like if we imagine that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine would say, okay, we are against this law, I don't think it would have be appreciated enough as a gesture of goodwill by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That being said, I think there is a chance. So Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in any case, needs to find a canonical solution for its existence, because by proclaiming the independence, nezalezhность, it has put itself into like a gray zone, which is not contemplated by the Orthodox canon law. So it cannot remain like this forever. So it might need to find a solution. It's probably looking for a solution. And this solution cannot be done without taking into account what the Orthodox Church of Ukraine thinks about this, what the Patriarchate of Constantinople thinks about this, etc. So I think the chance for dialogue is for Ukrainian Orthodox Church looking for a canonical solution and then engaging with other players, including the other jurisdiction in Ukraine.
If I may add one thing, as we have no other questions so far, I would like to, or maybe we have already. I would just wanted to add that I don't see the on the Orthodox Church of Ukraine side. I also don't see some serious ecumenical motivation. So we talk about the anti-ecumenical stance in the Ukrainian Church of also in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but I don't see any ecumenical move from the Orthodox Church of Ukraine either. They are part of the Church European Conference of Churches now, but they are not actively engaged in developing ecumenical theology. And this is also one part of the answer, how the Orthodox Church of Ukraine would be motivated to go on a dialogue in this situation.
Thank you. The next question is coming from Peter Jan Vins for Pavlo. There are voices in the Hungarian Reformed Church against the law, which go well in accord with the politics of Mr. Orban. Do you expect the Reformed Church in Ukraine, which is under strong Hungarian influence, or maybe other denominations, to start to depart from this united support for the law when it starts to be applied? Pavlo?
So the Reformed Hungarian Church of Ukraine would be the first on my list among the churches whom Ukrainian Orthodox churches could have reached to, in asking for support. This hasn't happened. I'm sure they are not very happy with the law. they haven't protested so far, and it's also curious why. So I think a wise move for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would be to try reaching to churches and trying to look for support. I don't know whether they are doing this. I have no indication of this. That would be, I think, a wise move to do.
I will combine two other questions because they are all about the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and the relations with the USC. The question, I mean, I will probably take the first part of Lauren Homer's question. I'm informed that the USC member of the All Ukrainian Council of Churches approved the new law initially, but changed their position following receiving instructions from Moscow. Can any speaker address this? I would probably slightly rephrase the position of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, to what extent it determines by instructions from Moscow or by the position of the church or by Metropolitan Onufriy personality, because this is sort of 100% statement that does not sound fully correct, at least to me. And the second question, it might be worth noting that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been excluded from several key meetings of the All Ukrainian Council of Churches in the last year, especially those with Ukrainian government officials concerning the law. In addition to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was due in 2023 to take up the rotating chair of the Council of Churches, which passes alphabetically among the churches, but was passed over with no public explanation. From the Lutheran Church, it passed straight to Adventists. Does this not call into question All Ukrainian Council of Churches' position as a non-political partisan organization? Regina or Pavlo, and then Regina.
So I might, if I may suggest or invite Serhii Bortnyk, to answer that question, because
Serhii, we can address this in the next session. So
yeah, because he was, I think, party at least of some discussions, and he is a member of this church, so he can, I think, comment with much more authority. What I will only mention that the statement in support of this legislation has been drafted as coming not from the council, but from the members of the council. So clearly they wanted to find a formulation that would exclude Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but still give some authority of council. And the journalists didn't pick up this subtle move. But I think that he would be a better person to answer. Maybe Regina as well. Thank you.
Regina.
Yes, I completely agree that at least for the question of the inner developments within the council, Serhii is the better one to answer as a member and as a participant of a lot of sessions. I just want to address the second question about the political, non-political character of the council. I completely agree. This is not a non-partisan or non-political or partisan or non-political organization, but it has been rather neutral for a long time, as long as the political strategy was neutral in relation to religious organizations. But exactly with the examples you pose in the question about the rotation, about the exclusion or the not so active invitation of participants of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and so on, directly shows that this council follows the political strategies of the state. And in the moment where the state policies changed and changed significantly, the council reacted to this and illustrates the politics. So it is not just the civil, just an NGO, something like this, but they are, of course, in contact and following very closely to what the state tries to implement in religious politics in Ukraine.
Okay, and I will pick up a question from Natalia Vasilevich and the second part of the question of Lauren Homer. First, the question from Vasilevich. There is also a wide multiplicity and polarity inside the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that's why it's very difficult to find a common decision for them. Who can respond to the inner dynamics in the USC? And the question or comment from Lauren Homer. The Russian Orthodox Church has since the 1940s been effectively controlled by the Russian security services, who insist all leaders to be informers or agents of the KGB, FSB. This appears to be true of the USC leaders. Does this justify asking the USC to separate its legal organizations from the Moscow Patriarchate. Any comments on KGB?
Maybe just yes, on KGB. Maybe just one point, because always when this argument pops up, which is definitely true, we also have to remind ourselves that also the leadership of the now Orthodox Church of Ukraine has been actively engaged in KGB activities. So Patriarch or Metropolitan Filaret is also part of this story. And so if we want to address this issue of being infiltrated and doing state politics instead of ecumenical and theological work, we have to address all churches and not only the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church. And there is a huge need of addressing and dealing with its own past in the Soviet times for all these churches. And this would be part of a true dialogue, which is not pushed by politics, but which has to happen between the churches on an equal level and with equal self-critical approaches. And also, this counts also for the question of Natalia. All the churches are diverse organizations and have very different groups. And we see, I think, very good and very positive developments of dialogue and encounter between different priests and lay people of the both Orthodox churches in Ukraine, trying to do something different than the leadership of their own churches, which are not obviously able to go for this dialogue and to really change the situation for Ukraine for the better. But we have this in other groups in the churches, as well as we have radical groups in all churches, which will prevent or hinder any idea of coming together on any stage. So yes, we have to address and to keep in mind this diversity of the churches.
Pavlo?
Yes. If I can add, so about the diversity, I think that there is a lot of diversity within churches, that's true, but the way I think institutions work, the way media work, the way churches work, doesn't take account of this diversity. They are all very monarchically oriented. Yes, media focus on the church leaders. Ukrainian Council of church organizations and religious organizations focus on church leaders or their representatives. So it's all very much focused on leadership. And if there is a problem with leadership, as I think there is a case in Ukrainian Orthodox Church, then the system doesn't work, because the system doesn't digest the grassroots communities we will be talking about. And this might be one of the effects of this Soviet past, although I think Roman Catholic Church in Europe has similar problems. But this is like a desovietization that every church needs. No, Catholics, Greek Catholics, both branches of Orthodox churches, etc. So without this, we will not find we will not hear the voices of the dissenters or the voices that are more prophetic, that are more creative, because church bureaucracy is not very conducive to prophecy, unfortunately, today.
Thank you so much. I think we can close this panel, and I'd like to give the floor to Thomas to moderate the next panel.
Thank you. We come to the last but one panel in our webinar. We spoke, as Pavlo just said, mostly about church leadership hierarchy, and now we want to bring it into another level, on the grassroots level. Bottom-up initiatives, what impact has the law on grassroots dialogue initiatives? And I'm happy to have two panelists from Kiev, from Ukraine, Tetiana Kalenychenko from the European Center of Strategic Analytics, and Serhii Bortnyk from the Kiev Theological Academy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So again, we know the rules already, 5 minutes, and then we have questions. Please, Tetiana, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and good evening to everyone, for those in European time zone. So in my 5 minutes, I will address shortly some practical aspects of dialogue work with God, and also some impacts as it was in the question and conclusions that we've got, and maybe some possibilities. And I would just jump in the very end of my speech and would say that there is a way actually to get both jurisdictions and other churches motivated to dialogue, but the only key is to understand how it's possible to be done in a safe mode. So first, there are several grassroots initiatives, and Serhii will tell you more about church initiatives, but we were answering as Dialogue and Action Initiative to the grassroots request, and both with church hierarchy representatives from September 2022. We've got several requests from both UOC and OCU who asked us to lead some kind of safe space where it's possible to talk about the situation of the May Council of UOC in 2022 and to understand what they can do with it and how they can respond to possibilities, maybe even not to unite, but at least to talk to each other and to understand each other's position and perspective. So we've got several separate meetings of UOC members and OCU members. We also got meetings with church hierarchy on a different level, at least on the bishops, archbishops, and metropolitans, in order to understand what's going on. And then we've got even several confidential mutual meetings with both jurisdictions representatives, and also in cooperation with some international Orthodox representatives and scholars. So what did we get? We got people like a group of not lay people, but priests and even bishops. I cannot name, unfortunately, that's confidential, but still there were a group of different church layers from different camps motivated to talk to each other, to ask tough questions, to understand what do they mean by their position, and is there any kind of possibility how to move on? Unfortunately, all the dialogue process, which was still leading partly, but it's more like in a format of shuttle diplomacy right now after all the changes, it was ruined partly by different law decisions and also by Kyiv-Pechovsk-Lavra situation, which we've got in the end of 2022, because of course it dismissed level of trust. And overall, I would say as soon as I'm working also as a secular mediator, it became not only church problem, it's like society problem. A lot of people who get no attachment to Orthodoxy, they are now aware about intra-Orthodox conflict, and then it's much more like national divider. So people think it's a measure of national identity, and even those who are not religious at all, or they are part of other religious movements, they insist that we should dismiss, for example, Moscow Patriarchate, because it's a sign of our independence as a state and as part of national identity. So what's the impact? That's low level of trust, no feeling of finding points of connection and feeling of total divisions. And there is no legal results on how they can move, because anytime when we were moving forward with some decisions with both group representatives, we've got new decision from the state or new decision on a local level, new violent decisions, but no decisions on some criminal cases against some purely publicly pro-Russian priests. But I'm sure that we got much more legal experts here. And what works right now? We've got still specialized meetings and workshops, for example, for medical chaplains and for those volunteer chaplains or for those who are working with war victims, because they've got requests not about intra-Orthodox dialogue, but they got requests how they could work effectively on the ground. And as soon as we've got mixed groups, you've got UOC and OCU members anyway, and there is some kind of space for them to talk and to talk about hard topics. Also, of course, there are still personal connections, and on the ground, people are still connected, even though it's prohibited on public level and prohibited by the bishops, but they can still talk to each other as human. And then they need really safe environment when it's possible to talk. And sometimes the only way is to create any kind of secular public opportunity not connected to Orthodox issues. And of course, there are some close and confidential formats where you can meet and to find some places where you're not as a priest tracked by your bishop, when you don't need to notify that you're traveling, and especially if you are traveling, for example, abroad on the other reason. So what do we have here? And the key message from my side, that there is a general approach for both jurisdictions, at least, and as actually you mentioned just recently about de-Sovietization, but also de-Muscovization of religious tradition. Because it's the same goal for OCU and the same goal for ULC, to recreate Kiev tradition, to recreate liturgy, to get de-Muscovization of architecture, cultural practices, language, anything. And it can be a mutual step forward and mutual path, maybe through the years, maybe dozens of years, maybe for another century, who knows, but at least to start this process of something common. And it can be starting from the history of the church and understanding the common background and fundament based on academic research, and also on seminary education for the future generations. And from the point of view of conflict studies, I would say that this intra-Orthodox conflict for the whole Ukrainian society, and especially now in the active phase of war, is a demonstrative case how you can deal with the problems when you've got, where you can lean on the law and, for example, some criminal cases, where you can lean on dialogue practices and how you should talk to each other or negotiate when it's hard, and how you can resolve the problem, not in a violent way. Thank you.
Thank you. Serhii, it's your turn. Turn off, unmute yourself, turn on your microphone. Yeah.
Oh. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much for invitation, and I will read my text. I have prepared it for 5 minutes, and I'd like to formulate some ideas. The title of our panel includes 2 parts connected with initiative, bottom-up and grassroots. The first of them may concern not only the topic of dialogue between religious groups, but also the involvement of the local authorities. I consider that the adopted law has already given an emotional impulse for seizure of parishes of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. A recent and sensational example of such an aggression at the grassroots level is the seizure of the cathedral in the city of Cherkasy. It took place on the 17th of October, less than 2 weeks ago. This is an outstanding example that in addition to the law we discuss, we should keep in mind the mood that was created through aggressive informational campaign in preparation for adopting this law. Such changes of belonging under pressure and with physical violence do not need confirming signs of affiliation and other procedures that are formulated in the law we discuss. In Cherkasy, we have an example of the merger of the local authority and the structures of the OCU in establishing the so-called civil religion. In their struggle against the UOC, the ideologues of the OCU demand their own exclusivist status. From their perspective, only they are a genuine Ukrainian church congregation, and their competitors are pro-Russian collaborators without any exceptions. What opposes this tendency within the UOC is a kind of Pharisaic position. The biblical Pharisees defended the purity of the faith and fulfillment of the law in its accuracy and completeness. Radicals from the UOC also refused to recognize any sign of ecclesia or una sancta in the competitive church structure. This includes the non-recognition of the key sacraments, baptism and Eucharist. I suppose that Ukraine needs to abandon these 2 extremes of exclusivism of both hierarchical structures and to search for a middle way that proposes the coexistence of both church congregations. Therefore, I would like to tell you about the Sophia Brotherhood Initiative. You can learn about its activity from its website, which is supported in both Ukrainian and English languages. This website explicitly states its main goal. The Brotherhood's primary objective is to fully promote inter-Orthodox dialogue in order to achieve unity of Ukrainian Orthodoxy, consolidate efforts and support initiatives of Orthodox Christians aimed at its development. It is worth noting that the members of the board of the Brotherhood are elected according to the equal quota from 3 groups: the UOC, the OCU, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. that a third party external to Ukraine is actively engaged. Most of the board members are clergy, but 3 of 12 members are lay people, including 2 women. From the ecumenical patriarchate, the board quota includes citizens of Ukraine who were forced to leave the country because of the war. The Brotherhood was officially founded only 10 months ago, in last February. However, many of its members have worked for reconciliation in Ukrainian Orthodoxy long before. On the part of representatives of the current UOC, this is a group of the so-called signatories. It means clergy and lay people who, after the beginning of the large-scale war in 2022, signed appeals to Metropolitan Onufry of Kiev with the aim to encourage the church leadership to leave the Moscow Patriarchate. A significant part of the Brotherhood's members from the OCU belong to the 10 Theses group. This was a group that signed a list of theses in the name of the clergy and lay people who enthusiastically accepted the Thomas on autocephaly for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in 2019. Under many important messages of this thesis is a call for dialogue, openness, and inclusiveness. In my opinion, the Sophia Brotherhood offers medial, third way between the 2 paths of confrontation I mentioned, the Pharisaic canonical purity and unification based on the concept of civil religion. In its documents, the Brotherhood criticizes deep alienation, mistrust, and formation of an enemy image between the both Ukrainian Orthodox jurisdictions, which leads to mutual dehumanization. They stress a mature need to renew our relationships to get rid of old claims and prejudice. This approach testifies that the Sophia Brotherhood is a unique movement striving for gradual reconciliation in Ukrainian Orthodoxy. Nevertheless, the law we discuss has negative influence on the members of the Brotherhood. The reasons is that the UOC parishes use hundreds of church buildings that have formal status of historical importance, and according to the law, the buildings must be returned to the state. For commissions that are acting in accordance with the law we discuss, formal affiliation with the UOC and unwillingness to change its belonging to the OCU is more important than active parish life, patriotic position of the parishioners, and the sincere search of rectors of these parishes for reconciliation in Ukrainian Orthodoxy. In this way, formal approach of the law we discuss treats the sprouts of hope for long-term peaceful coexistence of 2 main groups of Ukrainian Christians in Ukraine, Orthodox Christians in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the 2 contributions. I encourage you to ask questions in the F&A section, Q&A actually, and I would like to ask, I saw a very obvious difference in the 2 presentations in that Tetiana spoke about confidentiality, she couldn't reveal the names and so on. And I understand the Sophia Brotherhood is they have a website, you can find who are the members, you can see the meetings are public or publicized after that. So my question is, I want to challenge each other to say with these contradicting facts. Would you, Serhii, did you have any problems? Were there any problems because of that you were public? Or Tanya, would you think it would be also possible, or what is the reason behind your attitude?
So if I start to answer, so I am a public person. So I am a head of the charitable foundation academic initiatives, and it has its website, and it is my idea to often my ideas, my reports for broad publicity, and that's why I see no problems. I suppose that for many people from this brotherhood, I am not a member of this brotherhood, but for many people, they are between their church leadership, between the bishops of them on the one side, and between the state authorities, and also concretely between the perspectives of this law that wants to ban their parish activity. And that's why I know that many bishops now, not publicly, but formulate the willingness to cooperate with these priests. So now the UOC as a corporation is in a very difficult situation, and that's why on the local level, the bishops in the concrete regional centers, for example, are ready for some cooperation, but the problem is that as soon as I understand, the UOC leadership wants to preserve the structure of the church, and that's why, because they know there are different opinions, different interests, and so on, they don't make some radical moves, and I suppose it is a problem. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also the reason why we keep confidentiality, because we get different levels of attendance on the different meetings. And if you're a bishop, you cannot just be public against your church hierarchy, because you will be dismissed, or on the other way punished by your church leadership, as well as you are the priest. I know that's a different goal of Sophia Brotherhood, and I highly support them and monitor all the time what's their activity. But it's still a group of quite well-known, trusted, and public priests, and not only priests and lay people who are ready to be public. But that's not the story of in each case, in different regions, depending on the bishop they've got. And in terms of safety, as soon as if you need to address tough questions, you need to get some safe space. So that's my role mainly. And as soon as I'm a mediator, I should be trusted by both parts, because it would be not possible to make it. So that's the reason why we can get different formats. And also, so about next question about use, it's also the same question, because depending on a goal which you perceive, and for example, young people can be a huge resource for both churches. But what we've got there, we've got teachers in the seminaries for future priests who get different narratives, maybe some pressure on them, academic or not, and it depends. And also they need to be brave enough and safe enough in terms of resources, in terms of status, anything, to be protected, to be on public dialogue. Even though I was surprised, was just on the Ecumenical Social Week in Lviv in the beginning of October, and we've got UOC seminaries as attendants, and they've got a lot of public claims and questions. I'm really happy for such initiatives, but it can be counted on one hand. It's not a common practice so far, but still we need to preserve any kind of platform to start such initiatives and to start at least to ask questions, even if not answer in the process.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the from the participants. You already answered the one about young people and youth. There's a second one which says, in surveys, the support of the law by Ukrainians comes out very strong, and the popular support of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is almost gone. It could be expected that this support would be followed by a demand by lay members of the UOC to change affiliation to the OCO, but seemingly this is only happening slowly. Sorry, is this a result of the authority of the hierarchy on local level, or a covered support of the UOC? How comes that the UOC has not been emptied by its flock when citizens, according to surveys, strongly support the law? Maybe first to Serhii to answer this question.
Couldn't really understand the question. I'm sorry.
So, the point is, you have, when you ask people in surveys, you have a very low support of the UOC. You have only 4%, 5% or so, very low support. But people do not leave in masses the UOC. The parishes stay, people go to church and so on. So how to explain that? Is there pressure, or is it, do people support the UOC but do not say it in surveys? What is the explanation for this support?
First of all, I suppose that in many parishes of the UOC, there is no real political propaganda. If you come there, you can pray in the Orthodox style, and it is enough. That's why many parishes are an opportunity for people for a kind of private prayer, not private, but without these political implications. And that's why I know people that on the one way, they politically are for Ukraine, and they don't like maybe the politics, the church politics of the leadership of the UOC. But on the other way, I know a lot of priests in the UOC that are patriotic enough that assist the Ukrainian army and so on. That's why I suppose there is a lot of propaganda against our church, and people on the local level see another situation. That's why it is a common problem for Ukraine, I suppose. We have a local context, and we have a large situation, and we have mistrust between these two spheres. So locally, I am here, I am for my context, but publicly, politically, I can be against, but more abstract and not concretely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have one question in the chat and then one by Jose. First one in the chat, it's directed to Tetiana. Do dialogue initiatives take into account the context of attacks against the UOC, which affect trust and arguably hamper opportunities for dialogue, not only from OCU members, but from state apparatus, the judiciary, and then a quote from the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights. So the impact of attacks on your initiative.
Yes, thanks. So I will address several questions. So first, taking into account reality. We've got some UOC members who get, as I said, public pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian activities. They've got criminal cases. That's one case. And I think that in according to legal perspective, that should be different, not in general about the church as organization, but it should be private responsibility for some citizens of Ukraine who get concrete criminal cases. That's one reality. In the other reality, when the dialogue is possible, because the church relations is not the state relations, we've got other situation. And to the previous question, why people don't say in a public opinion polls about support of UOC, yes, it's lower. And of course, as a sociologist, I would say that please remember that's a sample. And it's not so easy to catch a UOC believer who is ready to say publicly that I'm a UOC member, especially now in Ukraine, because it can be dangerous. It doesn't mean it should be dangerous, but it can be dangerous because people can address in a negative form. So it's not popular to be, or you can claim yourself just Orthodox as we get this growing number of people. Also, we've got some militarist videos, especially after law adoption, from believers of UOC who said that we are defending our country on the front line and we don't want our church to be punished. So there are different layers of reality. But I think that our quantitative sociology doesn't catch reality as it is, because it's especially in a wartime. Also, I heard from other personal interviews of UOC members that they feel guilty to be affiliated with UOC publicly because they still stay in their church, but they do not agree with some decisions. But still, in order to get those positions, you need some space where it's possible to share, and also some movements. Unfortunately, churches are not the fastest organization. They're not like NGOs or business who can act in days and months. They sometimes need centuries in order to change. But we still get some movements, and especially bright enough from Metropolitan Onufry reaction. Of course, it's not the only one bishop in UOC and different reactions we've got. But taking into account about dialogue situation and those forced transitions, of course, we discuss. And before we started, there was like a condition from one side that we cannot talk with the other representatives before we stop it, but it's impossible to stop because it depends on the region and depending on the personal level. That each case differs, rather in village or in a big city like Cherkasy. So in an ideal world, I would say that that's the case for the state to secure this movement and to negotiate somehow to stop it, to freeze those transitions, and to get some kind of negotiation processes. But it's much more complicated, of course. And it depends on motivation on different sides. So yes, it gets lower, but at least when you got those transition, especially forced one, that's a good opportunity as soon as like in Sophia Brotherhood chat, I believe, to discuss those cases and to ask, what do you know? Is it real or not, which we see in media? And that's a good trust building activities that can be really small and taken not into account as a real one, but they got their results.
Thank you. I have a question from Jose. Please go ahead.
Yes, this is a question not only to Tetiana and Serhii, but to anybody else. Besides the obvious role of the ecumenical patriarch in the Sophia Brotherhood as a third broker or mediator, do we know of any such initiative on the part of other religious groups, let's say ecumenical groups, be it, let's say, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, given its official vocation of ecumenism, or Catholic groups like Comunitas San Egidio, or perhaps Nicolas may have an answer, some Orthodox diaspora communities in North America that could play such a role.
Okay, is there someone, Serhii, Anya? I mean,
I can answer.
Comes to, yeah, go ahead.
So I know that there are even now the contacts of our hierarchs with hierarchs of other churches. There is, for example, invitation for me from the Conference of European Churches to participate at a meeting in Warsaw. So there are contacts of different kind. I teach at the academy about the Catholic Church and Protestant churches, and this is usual contacts that were before, and they exist till now, and that's why this problem with the ban of our church is another part of reality. So I can also say, for example, many partners of our church on the official level are supporting us in this conflict with the OCU, but they are not ready to speak openly about this. So this is the problem. So there are a lot of critiques against our church in public sphere, but there are till now many positive contacts on the personal level, and I suppose it is also good.
Yeah, but also, if I may just jump in and to continue Serhii's what he said. So it can be different, of course, commissions and different Orthodox churches, but they should be trusted by both sides again and be neutral enough, which is almost impossible in the situation of Orthodoxy. World Council of Churches can be the one, but as soon as they visited Moscow, so they didn't deal only with the Ukrainian situation, they dismissed part of trust. And as far as I know, they got no concrete movements after that, unfortunately, and no concrete open communication. Even with the statement, even to create a safe space abroad, for example, to meet with different Ukrainian jurisdictions, that could be a brilliant idea, at least to discuss and to secure such space. So, and from the other perspective, I would say that it's possible to move through educational platforms. So when you, for example, move through theological education discussion, and especially with the help of ecumenical patriarchy in theological rights and explanations of the Thomas, of Chirotanies, all the questions, autocephaly, and the canonical law and history, that could dismiss a lot of questions from UOC to OCU and vice versa. And that could be one of the possible ways to start a dialogue, and especially, for example, if we involve something like Crete Academy, Volos Academy, and other educational platforms. Because through this theological education, you can dismiss it and move then with practical ones.
One can, I mean, that is not an official initiative, or it's not a group, but one could mention the trip of Metropolitan Tikhon from the Orthodox Church in America, which helped to Kiev and then to Constantinople, which has helped to establish the contact. Okay, but anyway, our time is over for this panel. Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Regina, who will moderate the last panel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And going smoothly to the last panel, also with a topic which has been mentioned already several times. The question, maybe one of the key questions of the whole law, how much we can talk about that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is part of the Russian Orthodox Church. And we have Thomas Bremer now switching his role from moderator to a panelist, retired from the University of Münster and professor of ecumenism and Eastern churches, and Nicholas Denysenko from Valparaiso University. Yes, Thomas, the floor is yours, and Nicholas goes second.
Thank you. Yes, as you said, many things in my short presentation were already mentioned, but not by me. So I'm going to repeat them again. And I want to make two short preliminary remarks. The first is what you just said, Regina. It is a core question, actually, whether the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. If the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is not part of the Russian Church, then Law 3894 does not apply to it. Obviously, as we see, the Ukrainian authorities and the UOC have different views on this question. And my second point, which seems to be important, preliminary point, is we must differentiate between our roles as faithful, if we are members of any church, and as scholars. As faithful, we might want the UOC to react in a different way, in stronger words, in clearer actions. But as scholars, we have to analyze what is there. As it is well known and said already in this webinar, in May 2022, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declared its independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. Until then, it was without a doubt a part of the Russian Church, most visibly in the liturgical commemoration of Patriarch Kirill during each liturgy, and the membership of the Metropolitan of Kiev in the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church and other provisions. In May 2022, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church stated that they are independent and self-reliant, difficult to translate these terms, and they changed their statutes. The church changed its statutes and thus also the practices which I just mentioned. The Ukrainian State Service, which is in charge of religious affairs, had an expertise made which came to the conclusion, we heard it already by Dmytro, that the UOC is still part of the Russian Orthodox Church. I have publicly challenged the methodology and the outcome of this expertise. I cannot, of course, repeat my arguments in detail here, but I will just make a few points. Methodologically, when you state something, you have to give evidence. When claiming that the UOC is still part of the Russian Orthodox Church, one must prove it. The expertise argued that they did not find evidence that the UOC is not part of the Russian Church. But to prove that something is impossible, one has to give positive evidence, and I do not see this in this case. There are two important aspects also partly already mentioned. We have to look at the official statements of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. People can and people do complain that these statements are not enough, or that they are not strong enough, or that they do not like the language. But that falls into the category of things one cannot analyze as a scholar. Again, for showing that the official statements are wrong, one needs evidence. It is methodologically not acceptable to contradict the church's statements because we don't like them. And actions and statements by individuals do not represent or change the official position of the church, also already mentioned by some of the panelists earlier. One can criticize what individual members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church do and say, but as long as the church does not change its position, these individuals do not prove anything. We know that there are bishops and priests in Ukraine who still commemorate Patriarch Kirill, but when they do it, they are clearly violating the rules of their own church and cannot be taken as evidence that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is part of the Russian Orthodox Church. This does prove, however, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is by far not homogeneous. So do the priests and lay people who demand that the UOC leadership declare autocephaly also show the heterogeneity of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So for me, the May 2022 decision by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to sever connections with the Russian Orthodox Church is credible, and I do not see evidence that it is not true. I see, of course, flaws and unclear positions of individuals, as just mentioned. But so far, no one can prove that the OC is still part of the Russian Orthodox Church. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicholas, your turn.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for your patience while I was teaching this morning. Wonderful panel so far, and thank you for the invitation to contribute. So I'm going to present my remarks from the perspective of opacity, vulnerability, and assumptions. And in this sense, they'll differ from what Thomas has presented. So I want to begin with the assumption of autonomy. And this is from an official standpoint. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in its statute and in its revised statute, refers to the Gramota, or certificate of autonomy, that it received from Patriarch Alexei II on October 27th, 1990. And this, they make the claim that they are an independent, self-governing structure on the basis of this autonomy. The autonomy of 1990 permitted the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to establish its own agenda, to oversee all internal nomination, election, ordination of clergy, consider and approve glorification of saints, while also remaining a part of the episcopate of the Russian Orthodox Church, which would include activities such as participation in the hierarchical council of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is up until May 27, 2022. The primary claim made by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church concerning the current phase of its relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church is, as Thomas just said, and as we have heard throughout, that it is now completely independent. One would then seek traditional markers of such independence from the Russian Orthodox Church that could confirm the Ukrainian Church's claim. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church appears to be making implicit claims of de facto, not de jure, autocephaly, in the language of what I would refer to as a via negativa, saying what they are not. They say that they do not participate in meetings with the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Orthodox Church is not in their statute. The Russian Orthodox Church does not provide them with chrism. The Russian Orthodox Church does not set their agenda. Looking ahead and trying to advance and make progress in this situation on the ground and improve conditions for all churches and religious organizations, potential examples of advancement in the degree of independence could include, as we heard in the previous panel, active communication with the leaders of all of the other Orthodox churches at the official level, clear signals of self-governance and advocacy of their positions and rights in international forums at the official level, statements on the current relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church that both confirm and build upon the declarations of the May 27, 2022 Sobor, which is now more than 2 years old. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but the issue at stake here is that any degree of opacity on who they are is not satisfying the most important stakeholders, which is the Ukrainian people. I want to provide 2 examples of possible ways forward. The first would be, for example, some kind of public position on the Russian Orthodox Church's adoption of the controversial statement of the World Russian People's Council on March 27, 2024, that identified the war as a holy war and claimed that Russia is fulfilling the mission of the restrainer. Refraining from saying anything which could fit, at least I think so, the via negativa, makes the Ukrainian Orthodox Church vulnerable to accusations that they support this position, even though one cannot confirm or prove that accusation. The opacity makes them vulnerable. The second example would be to indicate in public a recommitment to the next ecclesiological step of true independence, which is canonical autocephaly. Now, I do not have in mind here the usual conversation that we have in forums like this of terms of union or subordination to the ecumenical patriarchate or to the OCU, because the churches already have the means by which to negotiate these terms if the desire is present. But a statement that essentially says we see ourselves as a canonical autocephalous church would again reduce the opacity of their position. The recent lecture of Archbishop Sylvester at the Kiev Theological Academy indicates a process of setting their own terms and communicating their objectives, and would be, were it to be publicly confirmed in some way, a marker of a step towards autocephaly. This is one of the big issues that has the capacity to contribute to extinguishing the fire that is engulfing the Ukrainian religious environment, and that is for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to publicly communicate their objectives transparently in as much as they are able to. So in summary, the Ukrainian Church has a form of autonomy that they claim has now graduated to independence. Evidence of identifiable external markers of such independence would be helpful in public discourse. The communication style of via negativa, saying what we are not, is currently contributing to opacity, which makes the Ukrainian Orthodox Church vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this second contribution and impulse. And I guess we see how complicated it is to tackle church independence on this various levels. So I have one question by Thomas. We also have one question in the chat. Maybe, Thomas, you can also react to this, because it was a reaction on your claim that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has stopped commemorating the Patriarch of Moscow. So, Thomas, you are muted.
It was so good what I just said, but I'm sorry. So first of all, there was a very clear reaction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on this statement by the Russian so-called Sobor the next day. And I just put it in because someone asked in the chat, so I put the link for the English version into the chat, where it's very clear, and they say we're not part of the Russian world, it's not a holy war, and so on. So I think they made it very, very clear. That is, and what would that, and the question is, I will read it, what would the Euro autocephaly look like, and what would the process expected to be? Can the state advocate for such process? Well, I don't think the Ukrainian state at the moment is willing to advocate to advocate an autocephaly, a real autocephaly of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I also read the interesting presentation Archbishop Sylvester gave like a week ago or so on a conference which Nicholas Denysenko quoted, and I understood it. First of all, I think it's very important. Someone mentioned that earlier in our webinar here, that he underlines the importance of developing normal good relations with Constantinople as a first step, and I think that's very interesting. And then I understood him that what they are doing, what they did, and what they are doing is like moving towards autocephaly. And I understood always the problem is that if they declare it unilaterally, first of all, they will be in a similar situation as the so-called Kiev Patriarchate was in the 1990s and 2000s when it existed, and they do want to avoid it. They always criticize them for being not canonically, and they do want to avoid it. And how it can look in fact, that is, I don't know that, but we also have to see if they would, like someone said today, demand it from Moscow, or if they would declare it unilaterally from Moscow. That would be an even bigger mess within world orthodoxy. No? Jose said earlier in one of his answers, I think there should be an all-Orthodox way to resolve the difficult situation in Orthodoxy. If we had an all-Orthodox council nowadays, probably the Russian Orthodox Church, or the position of the Russian Orthodox Church, would win. It would have the majority among the local Orthodox churches. No? And Constantinople and the Greek, let's put it like the Greek churches would be in a minority position. So it's quite difficult. And if the UOC would try to get unilaterally autocephaly, probably churches which would recognize the UOC would have a larger problem with Moscow. So it's interconnected. And my last point maybe, and you can see that today was on the website of the UOC, a bishop was in the United States and had liturgy with a bishop from the Orthodox Church in America in Los Angeles. I know that in West European countries, they can celebrate with bishops from the Serbian church, from the Romanian church, and so on. So there is that's also a kind of way to show that they are on this course to have on this path to have normal relations to the other churches and eventually to come to autocephaly.
Marietta.
Thank you very much for both contributions. I'm just wondering about the occupied territories and what is going on with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church there. I think I've heard some people talk about the UOC being effectively integrated in the Russian Orthodox Church. So if this is true, this signals that the Russian Orthodox Church clearly doesn't take that declaration of autonomy, independence, or whatever we want to call it, all that seriously. But also, what is sort of the future of this church on both sides of the front line, given that in Ukraine it is tense, but on the other side of the front line, it seems to get subsumed within the Russian Orthodox Church. So is there even socially and politically a sort of long-term way out of this conundrum? I don't know the answer to that. I'm just thinking out loud, but really also to sort of highlight that it's not just Ukraine where this is a discussion, it's also a discussion on the other side of the front line. Thank you.
Who would like to?
Maybe we have to be in mind when we think about the Russian actions in the occupied territories, that according to the Russian state doctrine, this is Russian territory. They have integrated the 4 Crimea and the 4 Oblast into Russian Federation, not recognized by anyone, I think, except Belarusian also. But from their point of view, it's their own Russian territory, and therefore the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, and does not belong anymore to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So that could explain. The interesting thing is that, yes, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church does not protest when they, for example, remove bishops or change the situation in Crimea. But on the other hand, what they do on the website, they keep their own bishops. So they say, if you look at the website for the bishops in the occupied territory, on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church website, you will find always the ones who have been there before the war, and not the changes which the Russians have introduced. Yeah, maybe so far.
There's one interesting comment on this by Natalia Vasilievich in the Q&A, that she thinks that the fact that dioceses of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church are integrated in the Russian Orthodox Church directly is the sign that Ukrainian Orthodox Church for the Russian Orthodox Church is not the same as themselves, because if they would perceive it as themselves, they would not need to integrate them with some kind of official act or something like that. I would like to take another question from the Q&A to Thomas, I guess, or maybe to both. Regarding the public statement you mentioned, it was echoed by Ukrainian government's religious affairs Representative Viktor Zelensky. Mr. Zelensky said that his office offered the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in the form of a public letter, an opportunity to voluntarily demonstrate the actions the church had taken to sever ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church clergy then the asker then argued that Mr. Zelensky's request was unconstitutional, but also cynical. They warned that if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church were to make a public political statement declaring its complete break from the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church would likely initiate a schism procedure, leading to other national churches to view the UOC differently and causing the UOC to lose its canonical dignity. What is your response to this objection? So to the total mess of being canonical, not canonical, and who can pressure whom with this canonical status? Do you have any?
It was, yes, it was said earlier in one of the responses that the state should not push the church or any religious community to do certain things and to prescribe what they have to do. So Zelensky was very clear: you have to write letters that you resign from the bodies of the Russian Orthodox Church, and to write letters to the other local Orthodox churches that you are autocephalous and so on. So very concrete demands. And I think there are several points come together here. One is also, I think it's maybe a little bit underestimated here in our discussion, the personality of Metropolitan Onufri, who is someone who grew up in Soviet Union and was, as everyone knows, he is still a monastic type and so on. So he has this experience of being obedient to the state is not good for the church, no? And that was his Soviet experience, and it seems to me that he uses it or applies it now also to the Ukrainian situation. On the other hand, when I was in Ukraine, people told me from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, whatever we would do, it would not be enough for the states, and they would come up with something else. No? They push us more and more and more, and if we fulfill one thing, then another thing will come. So I never heard this argument about the possible schism procedure as the Russian Orthodox Church would start, but it could be plausible to me.
I would take Nicholas first, Pavlo, because he also has to answer some questions maybe and also put some comments on the questions posed.
Thank you. Yes, the main point that I wanted to make here concerning autocephaly and a demonstration of a commitment to autocephaly, if we look at the entire context, going back to this lecture by Archbishop Sylvester, where he seems to signal a commitment to canonical autocephaly, there's an acknowledgement within that commitment of the inertia that we have within the Orthodox world, really a dispute that is currently unresolved, and there are no steps in place to attempt to resolve it because the pre-conciliar commission leading up to the Council of Crete in 2016 was not able to get all of the churches to agree in consensus on the new mechanism for the granting of autocephaly. So it was simply not included on the agenda of the Council of Crete. And then you add to that mix the reality that 4 churches refrained from participating in the Council of Crete, which raised questions about the degree of authority that one can look at the declarations that they made. So we have disagreement on how autocephaly is actually granted. And this disagreement reaches beyond the Ukrainian situation. First, if we look at the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, we have a handful of churches that recognize formally their autocephaly, and none of the other churches have come forward to recognize it yet, and some have publicly indicated their protest or their concerns that caused them to refrain from recognizing that autocephaly. But a similar situation concerns the Orthodox Church in America, which was granted autocephaly by the Patriarchate of Moscow in 1970. And on the periphery, but I think still relevant, is the autocephaly granted by Serbia to the Church of North Macedonia, which the Ecumenical Patriarchate has not yet recognized. And there's a difference between recognizing autocephaly and recognizing a church as being as canonical and in full communion with the rest of the Orthodox Church, but not necessarily autocephalous, which I think muddies the waters. And that's the very difficult, swampy kind of situation that we find ourselves in. It's almost as if we say, well, look at the process and the result or the outcome, so that if you are a pastor and you're a pastor of an Orthodox church on the ground, you have to find a way to relate to these other Orthodox churches that are your neighbors, for example, in Western Europe or in North America, where one church says, well, this is an autocephalous church, and another church says, well, they're not an autocephalous church, and this church is in communion with this church, and it becomes so difficult that the easiest way to deal with it is simply not to say anything. And so from that perspective, I think it's the slowness of the process is both very Orthodox, very typical of Orthodoxy, and also understandable given the lack of an agreement on an agreed upon mechanism for granting autocephaly at this time.
Thank you. we'll have to look a little bit for the time also, but I would like to take two questions now together. One is Pavlo, and one is from the Q&A. So Pavlo first, and then one question from the Q&A.
So my question would be, what do you see would be a creative way for UOC to ask for autocephaly? So they don't want to proclaim autocephaly unilaterally. They don't want to ask it from Moscow. They don't want to ask it from Constantinople. What are the options you think they have and they should follow? There are more. I even have a couple of in my head, but I wonder what do you see as options for asking for autocephaly?
Okay, and the second question I would like to add is from Christina Stöckel. It's maybe a little bit a counterintuitive question, but do you also see signs of convergence between Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Orthodox Church of Ukraine, not towards unity, but in the sense that both claim to be patriotic, both suffer from the war, both see themselves as different from the Russian Orthodox Church on the level of liturgy, for example? So are there signs where they are also convergent in this regard? Please.
So to Pavlo's question, I would say, I think there is no good solution. There's no quick solution, which I tell you now, and in 2 months the situation is resolved. We'll have for many, many years this problem. I fear we have the problem in world Orthodoxy for at least for decades. And that means we will have in Ukraine most probably 2 Orthodox Church structures also for a long time. It's not even if banned, the UOC will not disappear and it will not join the OCU. So that means both will exist for a long time. And then one has, I also want to add, we have a lot of examples in church history where churches, Catholic churches, Orthodox churches, did not function canonically. When they existed, they were there, but it was against the theory, so to say. Right? Therefore, I think one has to find intelligent solutions, and there are some probably to how to organize canonically. I'm speaking now as a theologian, not from point of politics. The coexistence of 2 Orthodox churches in one country. Someone told me, for example, well, the autocephaly was given actually to Ukraine, to Orthodoxy in Ukraine. So one could have an idea like having 2 autonomies within one autocephaly or something like that, which would require movement within the OCU, which is not visible now. But as we know, everyone who observes the situation sees that there is 2 groups, at least in the ecumenical patriarchate. Some understand that they have to change something in Ukraine, others think everything is fine, and so on. So there is dynamics, but it's not something which will be resolved in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. To Christina's question, I would not say it's convergence, it's kind of parallel. Convergence means to come together, but I do not see that. But I see, of course, that you have a parallel development in both churches, the points you mentioned in your question, and also other points. So the churches are in fact very, very similar to each other. And as it's well known, we have no division or no argument in questions of faith or of belief or dogma or anything like that, doctrine. It's just about church organization, or if you want, it's about power in more worldly terms.
Nicholas, yes, your turn.
Thank you. Yes. So I am interested, Pavlo, in your ideas, absolutely, to hear how they might go about pursuing canonical autocephaly outside of requesting it from Moscow or Constantinople. And Archbishop Sylvester did address the first part of that, requesting it from Moscow, the optics, the likely outcome of that request. I think that, in all honesty, it's a constructive, continuous dialogue, and the responsibility does not exist only with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or with the OCU, but it lies with the other Orthodox churches, the churches that are not Constantinople and not Moscow. If this is truly a communion of churches, one church in una sancta, then the other churches have the resources and, I would hope, the desire and motivation to work with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to regularize their canonical status and to assist them so that they would not be vulnerable, and in the process so that Ukraine would be less vulnerable to the kinds of polemical and hybrid warfare misinformation attacks that are coming upon them in part because of the intra-religious dispute between the churches. So I think that the other Orthodox churches can play a role, and I think that Thomas gave some good examples of potential episodes that we saw from the Orthodox Church in America in attempting to assist. It just has to be ongoing. And the second point concerns the convergence. I think this is interesting in response to that second question. I'll be very brief. From the very beginning of the process of the appearance in late Soviet Ukraine, the legalization of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, you suddenly have three bodies, three churches that claim to be the authentic successors to the ancient Kievan metropolia. And you find this, they write about this in their histories, they start to adjust their meta-narratives. And I think that's an important convergence, is that all of the churches claim to be the legitimate successors or the legitimate inheritors of the Kiev metropolia. And we've heard people say along the way in scholarship that each church has some kind of a case to be made. I think the biggest point of differentiation concerns Ukrainization, and Ukrainization in the way that it is viewed, understood, and experienced on the ground. And this, of course, largely concerns the language that is used for worship. That, to me, is not so much a point of convergence. And I'm not saying that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church does not endorse Ukrainization, but it's an obvious point of difference. It simply looks and sounds different if one church is praying in Ukrainian and another church is praying in Church Slavonic. It's not a delegitimizing of Church Slavonic, but it raises questions, and it has been politicized throughout the entirety of the history of attempting to introduce Ukrainian into the Orthodox liturgy in the history of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so I think that's where the convergence, that's a flashpoint that needs further discussion. Perhaps it's an important point of discussion for grassroots organizations like the Sophia Brotherhood.
So this were, in fact, perfect closing words already by Nicholas, because you really wrapped up a lot of topics we touched upon in this workshop from the very beginning, coming from decolonization and stopping with the question of Ukrainization of Orthodoxy in this context. So I think this makes a great closing mark. However, I think we also saw how many problems and challenges are connected to this religious situation in Ukraine. And I think I heard from everyone on the panels that the law is not the solution for these problems and these challenges. It might even add more problems, or does so. So this is a huge field. Thank you very much to everyone of the speakers, of the audience who posed questions, for trying to somehow get a grip on all of these problems and challenges. It's just a starting point or one preliminary point in the discussion, in the debate. And I hope we all will stay attentive and aware of what is going on in Ukraine and how the situation will evolve. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being with this webinar, and hope to see you again. Have a nice day or evening, depending on the time frame. And thanks to everyone for being with us. Good night. Bye-bye.